What if the story of humanity is not a single straight line, but a fragile thread that has been broken and tied together again and again? We like to think of history as one long staircase leading from caves to cities, from stone blades to satellites. Yet the earth itself may tell a different tale, one written in ash, in water, and in silence. Imagine walking through a dense forest where ancient ruins sleep beneath the roots, the stones swallowed by time, their builders forgotten. Or picture waves rolling over a drowned coastline where entire cities might lie beneath the sand and salt, erased by the rising seas of another age. These are not just scenes for myth or fantasy. They are reminders that civilizations can vanish swiftly, leaving only fragments for the future to misinterpret. Perhaps we are not the first, nor the only, nor the final chapter of intelligence on this planet. Perhaps others have stood where we stand now, believing their world would last forever, only to be swept away and remembered as legend. If history has been reset once, maybe it has been reset many times. Welcome to historic sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. To begin imagining that history has been reset is to step outside the comfort of the textbook timeline and into a realm that feels both familiar and unsettling. Picture the neat lines of a school diagram. Early hunters with fire, villages sprouting in valleys, kingdoms rising, empires expanding, industrial revolutions unfolding, and finally our modern world of glowing cities and satellites orbiting the planet. It has the shape of inevitability, as though the march from darkness to light was guaranteed. Yet beneath that simple staircase lies another possibility, one far less linear, where each ascent may have ended abruptly, followed by silence, scattering, and the fragile beginnings of a new climb. The earth is a restless stage, and civilizations are actors whose performances may vanish from memory when the curtain falls too quickly. Think of Pompeii, frozen in ash in a single day, its bustling markets silenced, and its voices reduced to shadows. Or the Library of Alexandria, where perhaps hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of centuries were consumed in fire, their ideas lost forever. These are reminders not of distant myth, but of how swiftly memory can burn or crumble. If such losses can occur within our recorded history, what might have been erased in ages before writing, before stone monuments, before survivors had the chance to leave even the faintest trace? The problem is that human achievements are fragile against the scale of time. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, paper disintegrates. Digital memory, which we trust so completely, would not survive a generation without electricity to feed its servers. Walk through an abandoned city after only a few decades, and you already see nature prying apart glass and steel, weeds rising through sidewalks, birds nesting in rafters. Extend that silence for centuries, and the towers become rubble. Extend it for millennia, and even rubble dissolves into sediment. What remains then for archaeologists of the far future is little more than a scattering of stones whose story must be guessed. And guesses, no matter how careful, are not the same as truth. To believe that our timeline is complete simply because we have fragments is like trying to reconstruct an epic novel when most of the pages are missing, and the surviving chapters are stained, torn, and out of order. This is why the possibility of forgotten worlds is not only plausible, but almost unavoidable. Imagine a civilization tens of thousands of years ago, one that rose during a warm interlude between ice ages, building along coastlines now buried deep under the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. Rising seas would have drowned their ports, earthquakes may have swallowed their temples, and survivors, scattered inland, might have preserved only shards of memory. Stories of a golden age, of gods who walked among mortals, of a world lost beneath waves. To us, those stories become myths, stripped of context, told by poets rather than engineers. But the echoes of memory do not vanish entirely. They bend, they disguise themselves, yet they still whisper of what once may have been. Evidence of this fragility is all around us. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, a corroded box of bronze gears found in a Greek shipwreck, capable of predicting eclipses with astonishing accuracy more than 2,000 years ago. Nothing else like it appears in the historical record until modern clockwork, and so it seems like an anomaly, a miracle of isolated genius. But what if it is not an invention, but a survival, a fragment carried forward from an earlier, more advanced tradition? Or consider Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site dated to around 11,000 years ago, where massive stone pillars carved with animals were arranged in monumental circles. According to the tidy narrative of history, hunter-gatherers of that time should not have been able to organize such a project, let alone execute it with artistry and precision. The official explanation is that they were extraordinary for their era, yet another possibility is that they inherited fragments of knowledge from a culture now erased. When the ground is excavated, what emerges are not just stones, but questions, and questions are often more dangerous to the neatness of history than answers. The neatness itself should make us suspicious. Our official timeline is smooth, linear, too polished. It resembles a carefully edited story more than the messy reality of human experience. Progress is not a steady climb. It is a staircase with missing steps, sometimes collapsing under its own weight. Civilizations rise and fall. Technologies appear and disappear. Knowledge is discovered and forgotten. The Roman world knew concrete recipes we only rediscovered in the last century, formulas that allowed aqueducts and harbors to endure for millennia. After Rome fell, much of Europe forgot how to make concrete at all. Plumbing systems, public baths, even the idea of central heating vanished for centuries. If such forgetfulness can happen within the written record, how much greater must the silence be in the deep past, when no scribes or chroniclers were there to preserve what was known? This silence is not empty. It is filled with anomalies that stubbornly refuse to fit into the standard story. The Piri Reis map, drawn in the 16th century, appears to show parts of Antarctica's coastline before it was covered in ice. The precision of Pumapunku's stonework in Bolivia defies the tools we assign to its supposed builders. Myths across continents speak of floods so great they drowned entire worlds. Skeptics dismiss these as coincidences, errors, exaggerations. But when taken together, they form a pattern, and patterns hint at something beneath the surface. They whisper of cycles: rise, fall, reset, repeat. And here is where the thought becomes truly unsettling. If history has been reset once, why not many times? Each reset need not be global. A volcanic eruption here, a rising sea there, a plague that carries away half a population, a war that burns the libraries. These are enough. Survivors scatter, rebuild, forget. Within a few generations, the memories of greatness fade into legends of gods and giants. Within a few centuries, even legends become shadows. The earth is patient. It covers over ruins with forest, with desert sand, with ocean tides. To those who come later, the ground looks empty, as though nothing ever stood there. Yet beneath the surface, beneath our feet as we walk city streets, there may be layers upon layers of forgotten worlds. This is not about embracing every wild theory. It is about humility. It is about recognizing how much of the past has already been erased and how easily the rest of it could vanish. We are accustomed to thinking of ourselves as the pinnacle, the culmination of a long journey. But perhaps we are only the latest in a line of climbers who reached the summit, believed themselves secure, and then were swept away by wind, water, fire, or time itself. The skyscrapers that define our cities, the servers that hold our collective memory, the satellites that watch from above, all of them fragile against the scale of centuries. If reset has happened before, then everything we know may already be built upon forgotten ruins. And if it happened before, it can happen again. The more we linger on the possibility of forgotten ages, the more we realize that history as we know it may be shaped less by certainty than by survival. What survives is what defines the narrative, and what disappears might as well have never existed. Think of the fragile thread that holds memory together. A scroll kept safe in a library, a carving on a temple wall, a story whispered from parent to child. If any of these threads are broken, the knowledge at the other end simply vanishes. And yet we cling to our neat charts and timelines as though they were carved into the bones of the earth itself. The truth is that history has been rewritten again and again, not always through deception, but often through necessity, filling in the gaps with stories that felt logical at the time. But real life is rarely logical. It stumbles, collapses, and leaps in ways that our tidy narratives cannot easily explain. Consider the way entire civilizations appear almost fully formed in the archaeological record. Ancient Egypt emerges 5,000 years ago with writing, monumental architecture, social stratification, and complex art already in place. According to the official story, this was the result of gradual development from primitive settlements along the Nile. But where are the half-finished steps, the awkward in-between phases? How did a society leap from mud-brick huts to pyramid-building architects in such a short span of time? One explanation is that fragments of knowledge were inherited from an earlier age, handed down like the remains of an older language whispered to children who would never know its full vocabulary. Another example is the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, often described as the first true civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, irrigation systems, and codified laws seemingly out of nowhere. Did they truly build all this from scratch, or did they stand on foundations already buried beneath the sands? Even our most sacred timeline of agriculture may be far too neat. We are taught that farming began 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, where wheat and barley were first cultivated. Yet evidence shows domestication also occurred independently in China, Africa, and the Americas, often with remarkable speed. Was this merely coincidence, or did humanity rediscover skills that had been known and then forgotten? Imagine an earlier society already experimenting with crops, its techniques erased by flood or famine, leaving only faint echoes. Centuries later, survivors may have remembered enough to begin again, appearing in the record as though they had made a miraculous leap forward. When knowledge is lost and then rediscovered, it rarely announces itself as a return. It simply arrives, dressed as invention. This pattern repeats in technology. The wheel, one of the simplest and most transformative inventions, appears suddenly in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. Yet it does not spread evenly across the globe. In some regions, it takes centuries, even millennia, to appear, often in surprisingly advanced forms. Why would such a basic tool, so obvious once known, be so slow to emerge if it were truly invented from scratch? Perhaps the idea had existed before, forgotten during a collapse, then reintroduced in places where survivors still remembered fragments. Metallurgy follows a similar rhythm. The smelting of copper, the alloying of bronze, the forging of iron, these steps are treated as discoveries, but each requires complex knowledge of temperatures, ores, and chemical reactions. It seems almost too neat that such skills were independently mastered multiple times. A cycle of remembering and forgetting would make more sense, each reset erasing the craftsman, each rebirth forcing others to relearn what had once been common. There is a temptation to dismiss anomalies as mistakes in dating or interpretation, but taken together they suggest a larger pattern. Consider the megaliths of Baalbek in Lebanon, where stones weighing hundreds of tons were cut and positioned with such precision that even modern engineers puzzle over the logistics. Or the seamless stonework of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where massive blocks interlock so tightly that even earthquakes cannot pry them apart. These structures do not exist in isolation. They form a network of mysteries scattered across the world, as though fragments of an earlier age had been left behind, their builders lost to time. Were they experiments of isolated genius? Or do they point to a shared memory of techniques carried across resets? Even myths seem to conspire with these anomalies. Flood stories appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Bible, in Hindu texts, and in the oral traditions of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. The details differ, but the theme is constant. A world destroyed by water, survivors rebuilding anew. If all these cultures invented their own flood myths independently, it is a remarkable coincidence. If instead they are echoes of real catastrophes, glaciers melting, seas rising, storms drowning coastlines, then the myths become not fantasy, but memory refracted through time. Other legends speak of sky beings who bestowed knowledge, gods who taught writing, agriculture, or astronomy. In Sumer, they were the Anunnaki, in Mesoamerica Quetzalcoatl, in Egypt the god Thoth. Perhaps these were not literal deities, but memories of strangers, survivors from an earlier world sharing fragments of lost knowledge with people just beginning their climb. We cannot ignore the role of time itself as the great eraser. Even the strongest stone yields eventually to wind and water. Cities are buried by shifting sands, swallowed by jungles, drowned beneath the ocean. Without constant preservation, monuments crumble into anonymity. In just a few thousand years, the polished story of our own world could be reduced to a scattering of anomalies no less puzzling than the ruins we ponder today. Imagine a future archaeologist discovering fragments of a smartphone without context. Would they recognize its purpose or dismiss it as a curious ornament? Imagine a skyscraper eroded to a jagged stump, stripped of glass and steel, its meaning long forgotten. To those who come later, these relics might seem miraculous, out of place, the work of a mysterious people whose name is no longer known. And so the question grows larger. How many times has this already happened? How many worlds have risen only to fall back into silence? Each cycle would feel unique to those living it. Each would believe their achievements permanent, their cities eternal, their wisdom secure. Yet each would eventually face disaster, whether sudden like a volcanic eruption or slow like centuries of climate change. Survivors would scatter, memories would fade, and legends would grow in place of knowledge. By the time archaeologists of a later age began their search, the earlier world would be invisible, its story broken into scattered fragments that no longer fit together. This possibility forces us to confront our own fragility. We imagine that satellites, digital archives, and global networks make us immune to forgetting. But our memory is stored in servers that can fail, in files that require electricity, in data centers vulnerable to floods and fires. Without power, without the delicate web of global systems, the bulk of our history would vanish in decades. In 100 years, much of what defines us today could be irretrievable. To future eyes, we might seem like a sudden anomaly, a civilization that appeared, glittered briefly, and then disappeared, leaving only fragments behind. If it could happen before, it can happen again. And perhaps, just perhaps, it already has. More than once. To understand the possibility of resets, we must first grasp how fragile memory truly is when measured against the slow, grinding patience of the earth. Knowledge does not vanish in a dramatic instant the way cities collapse. It often fades quietly, slipping away piece by piece until only shadows remain. Think of the Roman Empire at its height, with aqueducts carrying water across valleys, roads stretching for thousands of miles, concrete harbors enduring the battering of waves. Then picture the centuries that followed, when much of that expertise disappeared. People walked past the ruins of aqueducts but no longer remembered how to build them. They lived in the shadow of stone arenas, yet lacked the engineering to raise new ones. To them, those relics may have felt like mysteries from an age of giants. This is not myth. This is recorded history. And if such forgetting could occur in the light of writing and documentation, imagine what could be lost when the written word itself is scarce or absent altogether. When archaeologists unearth fragments of pottery or half-buried walls, they do their best to stitch together a story from scraps. But what we see as the earliest known city or tool may simply be the earliest that has survived the accidents of time. Most of the earth has never been excavated. Vast regions lie beneath deserts, jungles, and oceans. Entire coastal plains that were dry during the last ice age are now underwater, out of reach except for deep-sea exploration. If advanced societies lived there, their remains may be inaccessible, their cities entombed beneath silt and coral. The record we possess is not the full book of humanity. It is more like a handful of torn pages, preserved by chance. Chance is a ruthless curator. Pompeii survived for us because a volcano buried it in ash, preserving snapshots of daily life. The Dead Sea Scrolls endured because they were sealed in jars hidden in arid caves. Countless other treasures have crumbled into nothing because they lacked such protection. We tell ourselves that history is solid, that the past is knowable, but the truth is that most of it has already disappeared. Written history covers only the last 5,000 years, while anatomically modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000. That leaves an enormous silence, nearly 300 millennia of human experience, for which we have almost no record. We fill that silence with guesses, with assumptions that earlier humans were too primitive to build civilizations. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It may simply mean the evidence has not survived. What makes this silence even more haunting is the presence of anomalies, objects or structures that seem too advanced for their assigned place in time. The Antikythera mechanism, with its gears capable of tracking the movements of the heavens, should not exist in a world 2,000 years old. Yet it does. The precision of Puma Punku's stone blocks seems out of place for a culture supposedly without advanced tools. The astronomical alignments at sites like Stonehenge or Nabta Playa in the Sahara suggest sky-watching traditions far older than expected. Each anomaly is easy to dismiss when viewed alone. But when seen together, they form a constellation of hints pointing toward a deeper past than we have been taught. And then there are the myths, the stories carried across centuries by the spoken word. Oral traditions can be surprisingly resilient. Aboriginal stories from Australia describe coastlines as they were 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were lower. Native American tribes along the Pacific Northwest tell of a great shaking of the earth and a wave that followed, legends that match the geological record of a massive earthquake and tsunami in the year 1700. These are not coincidences. They are cultural memories stretched across time. If such accuracy can survive for centuries, perhaps even millennia, then why should we dismiss older myths that describe floods, fires from the sky, or golden ages destroyed in catastrophe? These may be distorted but authentic memories of resets long before writing. One of the most persistent legends is Atlantis, described by Plato as a powerful society that vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. Scholars often treat it as allegory, a moral tale disguised as history. But similar stories appear in other traditions: Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, Mu in the Pacific, Wise in French legend, Sunken kingdoms in Celtic lore. Are these all separate inventions of human imagination, or are they fragments of a collective memory of lands and civilizations drowned by rising seas after the Ice Age? The ocean is a merciless editor, erasing coastlines, scattering ruins, hiding them beneath hundreds of feet of water. If an advanced society lived along those shores, their story would be buried beyond easy recovery, leaving only whispers to survive as myth. The fragility of knowledge is compounded by human actions. War, conquest, and deliberate erasure have destroyed vast archives. The Library of Alexandria may have contained the entire written wisdom of the ancient world, yet its scrolls were reduced to ash. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, home to centuries of learning, was obliterated during the Mongol invasions, its books thrown into the river until the waters ran black with ink. In the Americas, conquistadors burned Mayan and Aztec codices, eliminating records of astronomy, medicine, and history. Each time knowledge is destroyed, it is not merely the past that is lost, but the future that could have been built upon it. Progress is not inevitable, it is fragile, contingent upon memory. Break the chain, and humanity must relearn what it once knew. This cycle of remembering and forgetting may explain why certain inventions seem to appear multiple times. Writing developed independently in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, but always with sudden leaps from oral tradition to complex script. Metallurgy, agriculture, and navigation appear in bursts across the world as though rediscovered rather than invented anew. When Polynesian voyagers crossed the Pacific using only stars and waves, they demonstrated skills that would later vanish and require rediscovery. Knowledge does not always move forward. It loops, stalls, and resets. The unsettling implication is that our own world is not immune. We believe our digital age is permanent because we can back up data endlessly, yet without power, those backups are worthless. Servers corrode. Hard drives fail. Languages evolve, rendering old code unreadable. Within a few centuries, our vast archives could be silent. Our skyscrapers, once symbols of permanence, could erode into anonymous mounds. Our aircraft could be mistaken for fossils of giant birds. And future generations, walking among the ruins, might wonder who we were, inventing myths to explain what little remained. Perhaps this is the greatest warning embedded in the idea of resets, that what we have built is temporary, that memory is far more fragile than we wish to believe. Civilizations are not immortal. They are fragile experiments played out against the backdrop of a planet that erases with indifference. If resets have happened before, we may simply be another chapter, waiting for the moment when our words, our cities, and our achievements are swept away, leaving only echoes for those yet to come. When we talk about civilizations rising and vanishing, it is tempting to imagine their collapse as slow, a gentle fading of culture into dust. But history tells us the end can come swiftly, as sudden as a single sunrise. One day the streets are alive with merchants, priests, and rulers. The next, silence falls, broken only by the wind through broken walls. The Indus Valley civilization is a haunting example. Flourishing along the rivers of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, they built cities with advanced drainage systems, carefully aligned streets, and organized trade. Their writing, etched into seals and clay tablets, remains undeciphered to this day. Yet by 1900 BCE, the cities were abandoned, the populations scattered. Theories abound. Climate shifts, river changes, disease, conflict, but none are certain. What is certain is that one of the earliest urban societies vanished, leaving only ruins and unanswered questions. The Maya of Central America provide another reminder. At their peak, they built vast cities with pyramids piercing the canopy of the jungle, developed complex mathematics, and tracked the movements of the stars with astonishing accuracy. Their calendar system still fascinates us today. But centuries before Europeans arrived, many of their great cities had already fallen silent. Drought is one explanation, war another, resource depletion yet another. The truth may be a combination of all three, woven into a slow unraveling. Yet from the perspective of the people who lived there, it may not have felt slow at all. Imagine watching wells dry up year by year, crops wither, and neighboring kingdoms turn hostile. In a few generations, an entire world can disappear, swallowed by vines and remembered only in stone. These are collapses we know about because they left behind traces. But what about those too old, too thoroughly erased to leave us anything but hints? If a civilization flourished 50,000 years ago, what would remain now? The answer is probably nothing we could easily recognize. Even our own modern cities, left untended, would erode to almost nothing in just a few thousand years. Metal would corrode, glass would shatter, concrete would crumble. The most durable remnants would be stone monuments, and even those would suffer under erosion and tectonic shifts. To future archaeologists, New York or Tokyo might look like a scattering of stone foundations, with little to suggest the digital networks or aircraft that once defined them. Some researchers point to enigmatic ruins as potential fingerprints of forgotten ages. Göbekli Tepe, built over 11,000 years ago, challenges the tidy narrative of hunter-gatherers suddenly deciding to carve and erect massive stone pillars. Pumapunku in Bolivia features blocks of stone carved with precision angles and drill holes that seem far too advanced for the era assigned to them. Nan Madol in Micronesia sits upon artificial islets made of massive basalt logs, aligned with precision across a lagoon. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to remarkable ingenuity, and perhaps that is true. But it is also possible they are echoes of techniques inherited imperfectly from earlier worlds, carried forward by survivors who could not replicate them entirely, but remembered enough to try. Artifacts sometimes sharpen this sense of dissonance. The Baghdad Battery, a small clay jar with copper and iron components, may have been capable of producing a weak electric current 2,000 years ago. Was it a tool for electroplating metals, or merely a container with no such purpose? The Antikythera mechanism, with its intricate bronze gears, suggests advanced knowledge of astronomy and mechanics long before such precision was thought possible. If devices like this could appear, vanish, and then re-emerge centuries later, why should we not consider that entire traditions of technology could have been erased in the same way? Myths, too, reinforce the possibility. Across continents and centuries, we find tales of civilizations destroyed in flood, fire, or earthquake. In Hindu texts, Manu survives a great flood guided by a giant fish, an echo strikingly similar to the biblical Noah. In Polynesian stories, waves consume entire islands. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus. Are these simply human imagination reflecting common fears, or are they distorted memories of real events passed down from survivors of resets? If you strip away the divine and symbolic language, what remains often looks like description. Rising seas, fire from the sky, mountains that spit ash, skies darkened by smoke. These are the signatures of natural catastrophe, events powerful enough to erase cultures in a single stroke. And nature has pressed reset before. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 darkened skies across the globe, creating the infamous year without a summer. Crops failed in Europe, famine spread, and entire communities suffered from cold and hunger. That was just 2 centuries ago, from one eruption. Multiply the scale to the Toba supervolcano 74,000 years ago, which some scientists believe plunged the planet into volcanic winter. And you can imagine how a flourishing society, if one existed, might have been completely erased. Sea levels rose more than 400 feet at the end of the last ice age, drowning coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years. If civilizations had thrived along those shores, their cities are now underwater, hidden in darkness, waiting for submersibles we have not yet built. The fragility of human memory compounds this. Knowledge is not eternal once discovered. It must be preserved and passed on, or it fades. After the fall of Rome, concrete formulas were forgotten for 1,000 years. After the Mongols sacked Baghdad, mathematics and astronomy suffered setbacks that took centuries to recover. After the Spanish conquest of the Americas, entire libraries of codices were burned, erasing centuries of Mayan history. If this can happen in recorded times, what might have been lost before writing, before preservation, before we even had the tools to safeguard memory? We like to imagine that progress is permanent, that once a tool or idea is invented, it will never vanish. Yet history shows the opposite. Navigation skills have appeared and disappeared. Medicine has advanced and regressed. The Polynesians mastered the Pacific using stars, waves, and birds, yet some of those skills were forgotten and had to be relearned centuries later. The wheel itself was invented, abandoned in some regions, and then rediscovered. Progress is not a straight line. It is a pattern of remembering and forgetting, of peaks and valleys. If resets are real, then what we call invention may often be reinvention, sparked by fragments of memory carried across generations. The unsettling implication is that our current world is not the first to climb this high, nor will it be the last to fall. The skyscrapers that define our skylines, the digital networks that pulse with information, the satellites orbiting overhead, all are fragile against the scale of time. A single solar storm could cripple global communication. A sudden shift in climate could devastate agriculture. A war could erase knowledge faster than any flood. Survivors would scatter, memory would fragment, and legends would take the place of history. To those who come after, our world might appear as a myth, a story of people who built towers of glass and light, who flew in metal birds, who spoke to each other across invisible webs of power. Without context, without preservation, these would sound like tales of gods, not the memory of a people who once thought themselves immortal. If history has been reset before, then our place in time is far less certain than we believe. We may not be the beginning, we may not be the pinnacle, we may simply be the latest in a long chain of forgotten ages, each one believing it was the final chapter, each one erased in turn. If resets have happened, then the forces that drive them are as varied as they are relentless. Nature itself is the oldest and most unforgiving of these forces. The earth is not a silent stage upon which human stories unfold. It is an actor in its own right, unpredictable, violent, and at times merciless. Think of volcanoes, which can obliterate entire landscapes in a single day. Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE buried Pompeii under a wave of ash and pumice, freezing an entire city in an instant. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 sent shockwaves around the globe and darkened skies for months. And then there was Toba, 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano whose eruption may have reduced humanity to a near-extinction bottleneck. If a civilization had existed before Toba, its cities could have been erased without a trace, its memory buried under volcanic winter. Earthquakes are another eraser. The ground beneath us is alive, plates colliding, tearing apart, shifting over centuries. In 365 CE, a quake near Crete caused a tsunami that devastated Alexandria, collapsing buildings and drowning tens of thousands. In Japan, in 1700, an earthquake triggered a wave that traveled across the Pacific and was recorded by scribes in distant lands. Imagine the same power unleashed in an age when people built without steel or reinforced concrete. Entire cities could disappear in moments, leaving survivors bewildered, their myths later describing gods shaking the earth. Over millennia, the the scars heal. Forests grow, deserts shift, rivers carve new courses. To later generations, the land appears untouched, and the ruins remain hidden. And then there is water. Floods are among the most universal disasters in human memory. At the end of the last ice age, rising seas drowned vast areas of habitable land. Doggerland, a fertile plain between Britain and mainland Europe, vanished beneath the waves, leaving only a few scattered islands. Imagine the communities who lived there, their villages swallowed in a matter of decades, their descendants retreating inland with memories of a drowned world. These memories, passed on, may have become flood myths, retold until they grew into stories of divine punishment or cosmic reset. Across the globe, from Mesopotamia to Polynesia, the theme remains the same. Water as both life and destroyer, wiping the slate clean. Fire, too, plays its role. Before modern firefighting, a single spark could consume a city. In 64 CE, Rome burned for days, and though it recovered, much was lost. In 1666, London's Great Fire reduced the medieval city to ashes. Wildfires in ancient times could devastate entire regions, destroying crops, homes, and herds, driving survivors into exile. A civilization dependent on fragile agriculture could collapse in a single season of flames, leaving behind barren fields where stories of wrathful gods might take root. Disease is subtler, but no less catastrophic. The Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing nearly a third of its population. Entire towns were abandoned, entire crafts forgotten. In the Americas, smallpox brought by Europeans annihilated indigenous populations, erasing cultures before their knowledge could be preserved. If similar plagues struck earlier civilizations, the impact would have been the same. Survivors scattered, traditions broken, technologies forgotten. Disease does not leave ruins we can excavate. It leaves only gaps, discontinuities in population, unexplained silences in the archaeological record. Humanity itself is also an eraser. War is perhaps our most consistent reset mechanism. Conquerors burn libraries, topple monuments, and rewrite the past to suit their victories. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but countless archives have been lost to fire and conquest. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed the House of Wisdom, a repository of centuries of knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Witnesses said the waters of the Tigris ran black with ink. When the Spanish conquered the Americas, Mayan codices were burned, erasing centuries of astronomy and ritual knowledge. War does not merely destroy lives. It severs the chain of memory, forcing survivors to rebuild without the foundation of their ancestors. Even famine can act as a reset. A failure of crops drives migrations, shatters political systems, and erodes traditions. In ancient Egypt, famines triggered unrest and toppled dynasties. In medieval Europe, the Great Famine of the early 14th century killed millions and weakened society before the Black Death struck. Hunger is a silent eraser, forcing people to abandon cities, scatter to find food, and leave behind the cultural continuity that sustains civilizations. Without stability, knowledge cannot survive. Without knowledge, progress halts and fragments. Cosmic threats are rarer, but their impact is absolute. 66 million years ago, an asteroid ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Humanity has not yet faced such a cataclysm in recorded history, but we have evidence of smaller impacts, craters scattered across the Earth, some only a few thousand years old. A strike in the wrong place could unleash firestorms, tsunamis, and years of darkness. To those who survived, the memory would be incomprehensible. How else would they explain fire from the sky but as the anger of gods? All these erasers share one trait. They destroy not just buildings, but continuity. Civilization depends on passing knowledge from one generation to the next. When disaster kills the teachers, burns the libraries, or scatters the survivors, the fragile thread of memory snaps. The survivors remember only what they need to live: how to hunt, how to fish, how to build shelter. Complex skills vanish within a single generation. Within a century, even the memory of what once existed becomes myth. And within a millennium, the ruins are buried, the stories distorted, the reality invisible. This is why resets are plausible, even inevitable. The forces that could erase civilizations are not rare accidents, but recurring features of life on Earth. Floods, fires, quakes, wars, plagues, these are constants. The only variable is scale. A local disaster kills thousands. A global disaster ends an age. And once enough time passes, once nature has reclaimed the scars, we may never know the difference. We walk on land that has risen and sunk, across continents that have split and collided. The Earth erases its chalkboard constantly, and humanity writes new lessons in the empty space, each generation believing it is the first to do so. Our modern world feels immune because of its power. We have satellites to track storms, databases to preserve knowledge, industries to rebuild after disaster. Yet this very complexity makes us fragile. We rely on global systems that can collapse quickly if one link breaks. A solar storm could cripple communication. A cyber attack could freeze banking. A sudden shift in climate could unravel agriculture. For all our power, we may be more vulnerable to a reset than any society before us, because when one system falls, all the others follow. The lesson hidden in the idea of resets is sobering. No civilization is permanent. Each believes it will endure, yet each stands on ground that shifts, beneath a sky that can strike, in a world that forgets. If resets have happened before, then we are not unique. We are simply the latest chapter, written on pages that time will one day turn. To imagine history as a series of resets is to imagine memory itself as fragile clay constantly reshaped by the hands of survivors. When a civilization collapses, the story does not end. It fractures, it scatters, and it is retold in fragments that bear little resemblance to the truth. What is remembered is not the full sweep of events, but moments of terror, flashes of catastrophe, impressions that cling to the mind like scars. Over time, these scars become myths, myths become traditions, and traditions become history as taught to the next generation. In this way, every collapse rewrites the past, whether by accident or design. Consider what happens in the immediate aftermath of disaster. Survivors are concerned with food, shelter, safety. Libraries are no longer guarded, records no longer copied, monuments no longer maintained. Scrolls and parchments rot, stone crumbles, and the words of those who lived before fade into silence. The few who still remember try to pass on stories, but stories change with every telling. The siege that lasted months becomes a single night of wrath. A volcanic eruption becomes the anger of a god. A flood becomes a punishment from the heavens. Slowly, the truth is replaced by narrative, the narrative by legend, and the legend by unquestioned belief. We see echoes of this in our own recorded past. After the fall of Rome, the Western world preserved fragments of Roman knowledge, but the details of how aqueducts were engineered, how roads were constructed, and how certain medicines were brewed were lost. Medieval Europeans admired the ruins of Roman structures, but often believed them to be the work of giants or a long-lost race. In truth, only a few centuries had passed. Now imagine 1,000 years of silence, or 10,000. Imagine ruins with no records, no memory, no language to link them to their makers. How would the survivors explain them? They would invent stories, and those stories would become their reality. Sometimes the rewriting is deliberate. Conquerors destroy the memory of those they defeat. They burn archives, erase names from monuments, and impose their own narratives. In Egypt, pharaohs sometimes carved their names over those of predecessors to claim their achievements. In the Americas, Spanish missionaries burned Mayan codices to erase a worldview that conflicted with their own. Victors write history not simply by recording events, but by choosing what not to record. If a reset has occurred, the version of the past that survives is not the truth, but the most convenient tale, edited to suit those who remain. Religious transformations also reshape memory. Natural disasters become moral lessons. Floods are remembered not as climate events, but as divine punishment. Fires from the sky are seen not as meteors, but as judgment. Over centuries, these explanations harden into scripture. What began as a survivor's attempt to explain the inexplicable becomes holy writ, resistant to reinterpretation. When later generations read these texts, they no longer see memory of disaster. They see only myth. Yet hidden within the myth may be the last trace of an erased world. Language itself contributes to forgetting. When tongues change, records become harder to read. The Rosetta Stone was necessary to unlock Egyptian hieroglyphs because without it the symbols were mute. Countless scripts remain undeciphered today, from the Indus Valley seals to Linear A in the Aegean. If knowledge is locked in a language no one can understand, it may as well not exist. Imagine libraries full of books in forgotten tongues, repositories of wisdom reduced to decorations. If a reset wiped away the translators, entire civilizations could vanish from memory, even as their records sat in plain sight. Misinterpretation is another layer of the problem. Future societies may encounter artifacts without context and create explanations that are wildly incorrect. An airport might be mistaken for a sacred temple. A rusted car might be revered as the remains of a giant creature. Without understanding, people project meaning, and those projections become history. This could explain why so many ancient ruins are surrounded by myths of gods and giants. If advanced societies once existed, their remnants would have been incomprehensible to the people who came after, and myths would have been the only language available to describe them. Over time, the process of rewriting ensures that each reset erases not only facts, but perspective. The reality of what happened becomes invisible, replaced by stories that satisfy the need for explanation. Centuries later, archaeologists dig through layers of soil and try to reconstruct the truth. But what they uncover are only fragments. A wall here, a tool there, a myth inscribed on a stone tablet. They can guess at connections, but the original context is gone. It is like reading the last lines of a play without ever having seen the first act. What makes this cycle so powerful is how absolute it is. Once knowledge is lost, it is extraordinarily difficult to recover. The recipe for Roman concrete was forgotten for over 1,000 years, rediscovered only in recent centuries. Entire traditions of navigation, astronomy, and medicine have been erased and reinvented as though for the first time. If this can happen in the light of recorded history, how much more must have been lost in eras that left us nothing but silence? This is why resets are not just possible, but likely. Each collapse not only destroys the present, but also rewrites the past, shaping how future generations understand their origins. The neat, linear history we are taught may be the latest edition of a book that has been revised, redacted, and rewritten countless times. Beneath our official timeline may lie layers of forgotten histories, each one smoothed over by myth until it disappears entirely. And the process does not end with us. If our world were to collapse tomorrow, what would remain? Digital records would fade without electricity. Paper would crumble without preservation. Stone monuments would endure the longest, but even they would erode under wind and rain. Survivors would tell stories of the time before, of glowing screens, of flying machines, of towers that touched the sky. Over generations, these stories would become myths, stripped of detail, reshaped by imagination. Thousands of years later, archaeologists might stumble across fragments of our world and struggle to explain them. They might decide we were primitive, or they might conclude we were gods. Either way, the truth would be lost. The idea of rewritten history is both unsettling and humbling. It suggests that what we know about ourselves may be little more than a fraction of the truth, the rest buried in the silences between resets. We are not the inevitable endpoint of a grand progression, but participants in a fragile cycle of memory and forgetting. If resets have happened before, they have left us only myths, anomalies, and ruins to piece together. And if another reset comes, it will erase us in the same way, leaving only fragments to be rewritten by those who follow. Signs of forgotten ages often hide in plain sight. They are not the clear and orderly messages we might wish for, etched into stone with a neat explanation, but whispers, subtle anomalies scattered across the world, fragments that resist fitting into the puzzle of our official timeline. Each by itself may seem curious but unimportant. Taken together, they form a chorus, a faint reminder that the past may be deeper, stranger, and older than we dare to imagine. One of the most startling of these signs is Göbekli Tepe, a site in modern-day Turkey dated to around 11,000 years ago. It predates the accepted beginning of agriculture and permanent settlements, yet it consists of massive stone pillars carved with intricate depictions of animals. Some of these stones weigh more than 20 tons. According to the standard view, hunter-gatherers of that era should not have possessed the organization, tools, or knowledge to construct such monuments. And yet they did. Archaeologists explain it as an anomaly, a remarkable exception. But another possibility is that they were drawing on knowledge inherited from an earlier world, fragments carried through a reset. Imagine survivors of a vanished civilization guiding their descendants to carve stone in memory of what had been lost, unable to rebuild the cities, but able to echo them in enduring monuments. Scattered across the globe are other examples. In Lebanon, the foundations at Baalbek contain stones so large that moving them today would challenge even modern cranes. In Peru, The walls of Sacsayhuaman are built from massive blocks fitted together with such precision that even a sheet of paper cannot be slid between them, and yet no mortar holds them in place. Nan Madol in Micronesia sits upon artificial islets made of basalt logs aligned across a lagoon, a construction project that seems staggering for its time. We can admire the skill of ancient builders, but we must also ask, why does such precision appear suddenly without the expected gradual buildup of trial and error? The simplest answer is that it was not entirely new. It was memory, distorted, fragmentary, but powerful enough to survive. Artifacts deepen the mystery. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Greek shipwreck, is often called the world's first computer. Its gears, intricately arranged, could predict eclipses and track celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. Nothing like it appears in the record for another millennium. How does such sophistication appear and then vanish? If knowledge can leap forward and then disappear for centuries, perhaps it is because it was not a leap at all, but a rediscovery of something older, lost after a reset and briefly glimpsed again. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar with copper and iron components, may have generated electricity 2,000 years ago. Was it an experiment? An accident? Or the faint echo of technologies remembered only in fragments? Ancient maps provide further clues. The Piri Reis map of the early 16th century appears to depict the coastlines of South America with accuracy beyond the cartographic abilities of the time. Some argue it even shows parts of Antarctica free of ice, which, if true, would imply knowledge from a time before the continent froze. Mainstream explanations point to copying from older sources now lost. But this only pushes the question further back. How old were those sources? Who made them? If history has been reset, perhaps maps like this are relics of knowledge carried through the ashes of earlier worlds. Even the Earth itself preserves strange hints. In some regions, footprints resembling those of humans have been found fossilized in strata far older than accepted timelines allow. Tool-like markings in ancient rock sometimes appear out of place, suggesting hands at work where none should exist. These cases are controversial, dismissed as misinterpretations or anomalies. Yet they remind us that our timeline is not immune to challenge. If just one of them is authentic, the story of humanity stretches far deeper into the past than we currently accept. Myths, though less tangible, may be among the most powerful signs. Their persistence across cultures is difficult to explain if they are pure invention. Flood myths echo from Mesopotamia to Polynesia to the Americas. Stories of sky beings teaching agriculture and writing appear in Sumer, Egypt, and Mesoamerica. Legends of golden ages ending in catastrophe recur in Greece, India, and beyond. These tales are not identical, but they share motifs too consistent to ignore. What if they are not coincidence but memory refracted through time? Survivors of resets may have encoded fragments of truth into stories that became myth, preserved not in stone, but in imagination. Over millennia, the details blur, but the core remains. A world lost, a knowledge passed down, a cycle repeated. Even sudden bursts of innovation may serve as subtle evidence. The Neolithic Revolution, when agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent settlements appeared across multiple regions almost simultaneously, is often described as humanity's great leap forward. But how does such a leap happen so quickly, in so many places, without apparent connection? One possibility is that it was not invention, but reinvention. People rediscovered skills that had existed before a collapse, piecing together fragments until farming reemerged. If this is true, then the rise of civilization as we know it may not have been a beginning at all, but a continuation, a new chapter in a very old book. The challenge is that none of these signs alone prove anything. Göbekli Tepe could be an extraordinary anomaly. The Antikythera mechanism could be the work of isolated genius. Flood myths could be metaphors. Out-of-place artifacts could be errors. But when these signs are taken together, they form a pattern too persistent to ignore. They whisper of forgotten ages, of worlds erased, of knowledge carried forward imperfectly. They do not shout. They murmur, buried in stone, hidden in maps, woven into myth. And like faint voices carried across a great distance, they are easy to dismiss until we listen carefully. Time itself conspires to keep these voices faint. Organic materials decay, metals corrode, stone erodes, earthquakes bury ruins, volcanoes entomb cities, seas swallow coastlines. Survivors of resets cling to what they can, but without stability, memory shatters. By the time archaeologists of a later age begin to dig, they are searching not for whole histories, but for fragments, hoping to reconstruct stories from scattered clues. And each fragment must compete against skepticism, against the desire for neatness, against the comfort of the official timeline. Yet perhaps the greatest sign of all is how quickly we forget. Even in our own world, only a few generations stand between knowledge and silence. If electricity failed tomorrow, our digital archives would vanish within decades. If our cities were abandoned, they would be rubble within centuries. If our languages shifted, our books might become unreadable. To those who come after, our world could look like an enigma, our technologies like the tools of gods. They would find signs of us just as we find signs of those who came before. Whispers, anomalies, fragments. If history has been reset more than once, then signs of forgotten ages are not exceptions to the rule. They are the rule itself, faint reminders that we live not at the beginning, but deep within a cycle of memory and loss. Each sign is a fragment of a forgotten story. And when we gather those fragments together, we glimpse not a straight line of progress, but a spiral, rising and falling, written and erased, again and again. If resets have shaped the story of humanity, then the greatest forces behind them must be examined not as distant possibilities, but as recurring agents of change. These are the great erasers of time: nature, war, famine, disease, and the cosmos itself. They do not simply topple walls or scatter populations. They sever the chain of memory, destroy continuity, and leave survivors to rebuild with little more than fragments of the past. Volcanoes are among the most dramatic of these erasers. Mount Tambora in 1815 plunged the world into what became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed in Europe and North America, famine spread, and skies darkened across continents. That was just one eruption. Imagine something on the scale of Toba 74,000 years ago. The ash cloud blanketed the skies, blocking the sun, plunging temperatures for years. Scientists believe humanity itself barely survived. If an advanced civilization had existed then, it could have been erased completely, its cities buried, its knowledge scattered. The survivors, reduced to hunting and gathering, would tell their descendants stories of fire in the sky and endless night. stories that over millennia became myths of divine wrath. Earthquakes strike with equal brutality. In a single instant, they can undo centuries of building. The 2004 Indian Ocean quake generated a tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands and wiped entire coastlines clean. If such an event had struck in the deep past, when settlements were smaller and records fragile, it could have erased whole cultures without leaving survivors to tell the tale. The ground itself is unstable. Tectonic plates shift, lands rise and sink. Cities could vanish beneath new mountains or slip beneath the sea, leaving only faint traces for future ages. Water, the giver of life, is also its most ruthless destroyer. Floods devastate not only through sudden surges, but through the slow inevitability of rising seas. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers raised ocean levels by more than 400 feet. Imagine the coastlines of today, with their ports, industries, and cities, vanishing beneath the waves. Vast areas like Doggerland between Britain and Europe were swallowed, erasing entire landscapes of human habitation. If advanced societies had thrived there, they are now entombed beneath silt, their ruins unreachable. Myths of great floods may be echoes of these real events, remembered not as climate shifts, but as world-ending disasters. Fire on land is no less effective. Cities built of wood could be reduced to ashes in hours. The Great Fire of London in 1666 consumed much of the medieval city. In earlier times, when firefighting was primitive or non-existent, flames could erase entire communities. Wildfires sparked by droughts, or lightning could sweep across regions, turning fertile land into wasteland. To survivors, such events might seem like divine punishment. Over generations, the story of a firestorm might evolve into a tale of gods hurling weapons from the sky. Disease has been one of history's most silent yet devastating erasers. The Black Death killed nearly a third of Europe in the 14th century. Entire villages were abandoned, skills lost, traditions forgotten. In the Americas, smallpox and other diseases brought by Europeans decimated indigenous populations, destroying cultures before they could be recorded. Disease does not leave ruins to study. It leaves gaps, silences, unexplained disappearances. If earlier civilizations succumbed to pandemics, the only traces might be scattered bones and legends of curses. The knowledge of how they lived, what they built, and what they believed would vanish with them. War adds a deliberate cruelty to the act of erasure. Armies destroy not just enemies, but memory itself. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous loss, but it is far from unique. The Mongols destroyed the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, erasing centuries of scholarship. Spanish conquistadors burned Mayan and Aztec codices, erasing astronomical charts, histories, and rituals. War kills teachers, artisans, and scribes, the carriers of knowledge, and replaces their memory with silence. Victors rewrite history, painting the vanquished as savages or erasing them entirely. To future generations, the truth is not lost by accident, but buried under layers of propaganda and deliberate forgetting. Famine, too, is an eraser. When food vanishes, societies unravel, people abandon cities, traditions break, and memory fades in the chaos of survival. The Great Famine in Europe weakened millions, making the population vulnerable to the plague that followed. In ancient times, crop failure could spell the end of entire kingdoms. Without abundance, there is no stability. Without stability, knowledge is the first casualty. skills that require peace, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, vanish when every waking moment is devoted to finding food. And then there is the cosmos, silent and indifferent. 66 million years ago, an asteroid impact ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Humanity has not faced such an event in recorded history, but the Earth is littered with craters. Some are only a few thousand years old. Even a relatively small impact could devastate a region, triggering fires, tsunamis, and climate shifts. Survivors might look at the sky with fear, telling their descendants of a star that fell and burned the world. Over centuries, such memories would solidify into myth. Zeus hurling thunderbolts, gods of fire punishing mortals. The truth of a cosmic impact would be lost, replaced by stories meant to explain the inexplicable. All these forces share one trait. They do not simply destroy, they break continuity. Civilization is a chain of memory, each generation passing knowledge to the next. When disasters sever that chain, knowledge vanishes faster than stone walls or monuments. Survivors focus on immediate needs, forgetting complex sciences, abandoning technologies they cannot maintain. Within a generation, advanced skills may be lost. Within a century, even the memory of them fades. What remains becomes legend, stripped of detail, reshaped by imagination. The unsettling truth is that these erasers are not rare. They are constants of life on Earth. Volcanoes erupt, seas rise, diseases spread, wars rage, asteroids strike. The only difference between a disaster that scars a region and one that resets history is scale. When multiple disasters coincide, even the most advanced society can collapse. And once it collapses, time itself ensures that the traces are buried, eroded, or forgotten. Our modern world is not exempt. We imagine satellites, power grids, and global communication make us invincible. Yet our very interconnectedness makes us fragile. A solar storm could disable satellites and power systems. A cyber attack could freeze global commerce. Climate change could unravel agriculture. A pandemic could strain our systems to collapse. If multiple events struck at once, the result could be catastrophic. The survivors would scatter, memory would fracture, and our own age could become another forgotten chapter, reduced to myths of towers that touched the sky and lights that shone without fire. The lesson of the great erasers is sobering. Civilization is not destroyed by a single blow, but by the loss of continuity, the breaking of memory. And once memory is gone, the story itself is rewritten by those left behind. If resets have happened before, these erasers were the authors. And if another reset comes, they will write the end of our chapter too. When we think of nature pressing reset, we often imagine cataclysms so sudden and vast that no one could possibly survive. Yet history shows that collapse does not always come with a single explosion or wave. Sometimes it arrives slowly through the quiet persistence of ice, water, or shifting climate. It is these gradual but relentless processes that reshape the world in ways even more devastating than one-time disasters, because they transform not just cities, but entire landscapes, leaving survivors to adapt or vanish. Ice has perhaps been the greatest sculptor of forgotten ages. During the last ice age, glaciers covered enormous swaths of the planet, grinding mountains into valleys, pushing soil aside, and reshaping continents. When the ice retreated, it was not a gentle exit. Sea levels rose dramatically, drowning coastal plains that had been home to humans for thousands of years. Imagine a civilization flourishing along those ancient shores, building villages, harbors, perhaps even cities, only to watch their land disappear inch by inch beneath the advancing sea. To those who lived there, it would have felt like the world itself was shrinking, the ocean swallowing their homes generation after generation. Their descendants might have retreated inland, carrying with them stories of a world that once stretched farther out, stories that eventually became myths of lost lands or sunken kingdoms. Even today, we find traces of these drowned worlds. Off the coast of India, divers have discovered submerged structures near Dwarka, suggesting ancient settlements now buried underwater. In Japan's Yonaguni Monument, terraces and steps lie beneath the waves, debated endlessly as natural formations or the remnants of human construction. Off the coasts of Europe, sonar has mapped what could be the outlines of rivers and valleys beneath the sea, landscapes once alive with forests and plains. Whether these were homes to advanced societies or not, they remind us how much of the Earth's memory lies beneath oceans, unreachable and silent. If resets have happened, the greatest archives of lost civilizations may be hidden in the depths, where light does not reach. Climate change has also been a recurring reset button, long before humans began altering the atmosphere themselves. The Sahara Desert, for example, was once a lush savanna filled with rivers, lakes, and wildlife. Ancient cave paintings show giraffes, elephants, and even swimming humans. Thousands of years ago, this green Sahara supported communities who hunted, fished, and farmed. Then, in a matter of centuries, rainfall patterns shifted, the rivers dried, and fertile plains became a wasteland of sand. Those who lived there either adapted or fled, and with their departure, much of their culture and memory disappeared. What we see now is a desert, but beneath its dunes may lie ruins of forgotten societies, buried too deep for easy discovery. The Pacific Islands carry their own warnings. Oral traditions tell of great waves that swallowed villages, reshaping coastlines in an instant. Geological records confirm that tsunamis and volcanic eruptions struck these regions, events powerful enough to wipe out entire communities. Imagine a culture that flourished on low-lying islands, only to be erased in a single day by walls of water. Survivors might rebuild on other shores, but the knowledge of their ancestors' world would be lost beneath the ocean. Over time, the memory would shrink into legend, tales of gods who punished mortals or seas that rose in anger. Earthquakes, though sudden, leave legacies that unfold slowly. A great quake can destroy a city, but tectonic shifts over centuries can bury ruins beneath new layers of rock or sink them into the sea. The Mediterranean, with its volatile geology, is littered with submerged ruins. Cities once thriving along coasts now lie underwater, broken and forgotten. If we have found a few, how many more remain hidden, waiting for some future age of exploration to stumble upon them? Volcanic eruptions can also trigger long-term transformations. The eruption of Mount Tambora created years of global cooling. Crops failed in Europe and Asia, famine spread, and societies weakened. A supervolcano like Yellowstone or Toba could alter the climate for decades, even centuries. In such an event, it would not be the eruption itself that ended a civilization, but the chain reaction: failed harvests, famine, migration, war. Over generations, survivors would adapt to new conditions, but much of their knowledge would vanish. Their descendants might remember the time of darkness and hunger, not as climate disruption, but as an age when gods withdrew their favor. Beyond Earth, the cosmos itself remains the most unpredictable eraser. Asteroids strike infrequently, but when they do, they change everything. The Chicxulub impact that ended the age of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago is the most famous, but smaller impacts have scarred our planet even within the time of humans. The Tunguska event of 1908 flattened forests in Siberia, sparing cities only by chance. If it had struck a populated region, millions could have died, and survivors might have told stories of a fiery god descending from the sky. Multiply that by a larger impact, and an entire civilization could vanish, its ruins buried under fire and rubble, its memory reduced to legends of stars falling to Earth. These natural erasers are not just historical curiosities. They are reminders of the planet's restlessness. Earthquakes, floods, eruptions, and impacts have happened before, and they will happen again. The difference between a local tragedy and a global reset lies only in the scale. A flood may destroy one valley, or it may swallow an entire continent. A volcano may bury a city, or it may plunge the world into years of darkness. The line between continuity and erasure is thin, and history has crossed it many times. Our modern world, for all its sophistication, is no safer. We may have satellites that warn of storms, but what if a storm is global? We may have archives of knowledge, but most of it is stored digitally, fragile against the loss of electricity. If seas continue to rise, cities from Miami to Jakarta to Shanghai may be drowned, just as Doggerland once was. If a supervolcano erupted tomorrow, global trade networks could collapse within months. If an asteroid struck, there might be no warning at all. Survivors would scatter, memory would shatter, and in a few generations our world of screens and satellites could be remembered only as myth. The humbling truth is that resets do not require supernatural intervention. They are written into the rhythms of the planet and the cosmos. The Earth has always been restless, and civilizations, no matter how advanced, remain fragile against its power. When we look at the ruins of the past, we see not just what was built, but what was lost. And in those ruins lies a warning that our age, too, stands on shifting ground. If history has been reset before, then we are not unique. We are only the latest story inscribed on a page the Earth may turn at any moment. When we turn from the raw power of nature to the works of humanity itself, we find that war has often been the most deliberate eraser of memory. Unlike earthquakes or floods, war does not simply destroy by accident. It chooses its targets, burning libraries, smashing statues, silencing voices. War erases not just people, but their stories, and in doing so it can reset the trajectory of entire civilizations. Buildings can be rebuilt, populations can recover, but when knowledge is gone, it often never returns. The Library of Alexandria has become the great symbol of this erasure. Though the details of its destruction are debated, the loss is clear. Scrolls from across the ancient world, covering medicine, astronomy, history, and philosophy, may have vanished in a single blaze. Imagine the centuries of wisdom that were erased in those flames. What ideas were lost? What discoveries never carried forward? The destruction of one building, one repository of knowledge, may have delayed human progress by centuries. To those who lived through it, The fire was an event. To those who came after, it was a reset. But Alexandria is only one example. In 1258, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, destroying the House of Wisdom, perhaps the greatest library of the medieval world. Works of mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, painstakingly gathered for centuries, were thrown into the Tigris River. Accounts say the waters ran black with ink. The devastation was not just physical, it was intellectual. A thriving hub of science and culture was silenced, and the region's progress in many fields stalled for generations. This was not merely a battle. It was a reset of knowledge, a wound from which memory never fully healed. In the Americas, conquest carried the same brutality. When Spanish conquistadors encountered Mayan and Aztec cultures, they saw codices filled with symbols they could not understand. Rather than preserve them, they burned them, erasing centuries of history, astronomy, and ritual. Only a handful of codices survive today, and they hint at a vast body of knowledge that is now gone. Imagine the generations of scribes who had recorded eclipses, harvests, and dynasties, their work reduced to ash in a matter of hours. For the survivors, the destruction was not just material, it was spiritual, a severing of their connection to the past. And once the chain of memory was broken, the reset was complete. War also rewrites history in subtler ways. Victors impose their own narratives, reshaping the past to suit their present needs. The records of the defeated are destroyed or altered, their monuments defaced, their names erased. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs sometimes chiseled away the names of predecessors to claim their achievements. In Rome, disgraced emperors were subjected to damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, where their statues were toppled and their names stricken from records. The intention was clear: to rewrite the story so that the erased had never existed. For future generations, the truth became impossible to recover. War, in this sense, is not only an eraser of buildings, but of identity itself. The fall of the Roman Empire shows how war can unravel complexity. At its peak, Rome had aqueducts, roads, concrete, and public works of staggering sophistication. But repeated invasions, internal strife, and collapse of order dismantled these systems. In many parts of Europe, people no longer knew how to build what their ancestors had built. Concrete, once common, disappeared for 1,000 years. Central heating vanished. Public baths and aqueducts fell into ruin. For the people living in the ruins, the memory of Rome must have felt like legend. Without continuity, progress was reversed, and societies returned to simpler technologies. This was not just decline, it was a reset. Even in more recent times, war has erased irreplaceable records. During World War II, libraries, archives, and museums across Europe were bombed, looted, or burned. Centuries of documents were lost in a few nights of firebombing. The fragile chain of human memory was severed again and again, each time resetting the knowledge that could be carried forward. If this happens in the age of printing presses and mass literacy, how much more must have been lost in earlier times, when records were scarce and fragile? The frightening efficiency of war as an eraser lies in its ability to target the very guardians of memory. Scholars, artisans, and teachers are killed. Libraries and universities are destroyed. Trade networks collapse, severing the exchange of ideas. Once the keepers of knowledge are gone, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Within a generation, complex skills are forgotten. Within a century, myths replace facts. The survivors remember only fragments, vague stories of cities that once stood, technologies they can no longer explain. And by the time archaeologists of a later age uncover the ruins, the story has already been rewritten. This cycle may explain why some inventions appear, vanish, and then reappear centuries later. Metallurgy, navigation, medicine, even writing itself seem to bloom, disappear, and bloom again in different regions. War, combined with famine and disease, could have wiped out the specialists and the archives, forcing survivors to rebuild from scratch. What looks like independent invention may in fact be reinvention, sparked by fragments that survived the reset. If history has been reset by war before, then we must consider our own vulnerability. In an age of nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, and global conflict, the potential for self-inflicted reset is greater than ever. Our information is digital, our infrastructure interconnected, our archives dependent on fragile networks of electricity and storage. A single large-scale conflict could erase more knowledge in a year than centuries of slow decay. Imagine if the internet collapsed, servers destroyed, power grids silenced. How much of our world would vanish, not in centuries, but in days? The unsettling truth is that war has always been a reset mechanism, and nothing in our age suggests we are immune. If history has been reset more than once, war has been both the hammer and the chisel, smashing memory and reshaping the fragments that remain. The ruins of the past remind us not only of what was built, but of what was destroyed. And in those ruins lies a warning that our own age, for all its sophistication, is as vulnerable to erasure as any that came before. War teaches us that civilizations do not fall only when nature strikes. They fall when people themselves turn against their own memory, burning the pages of history and leaving silence in their place. If resets have happened before, war has been their handmaiden. And if another reset comes, it may be of our own making, an act of deliberate forgetting written in fire and ash. When we imagine the record of human history, we picture it as a library, neatly stacked with books waiting to be read. But the truth is more sobering. Most of those books are missing, burned, or never written at all. What remains is a scattering of torn pages, stitched together into a narrative that feels complete only because we want it to. This is the vanishing records problem, the quietest but perhaps the most devastating of all the forces that reset our memory. For history is not stored in stone by default. It is stored in fragile mediums, paper, wood, cloth, digital code, that vanish far faster than we like to admit. Consider how short-lived most human creations really are. A single fire can consume an archive of scrolls. Moisture can rot centuries of parchment. Insects can eat through libraries in a matter of months. Even stone monuments, when left to the wind and rain, erode until their inscriptions are unreadable. Without constant preservation, without guardians to copy and recopy the records, time itself devours memory. Written history as we know it stretches back only 5,000 years, yet humans in their modern form have walked the earth for at least 300,000. That leaves an ocean of silence, hundreds of thousands of years for which we have no words, no chronicles, no stories written down. We assume those ages were primitive, but what if they were simply forgotten? Their records erased not by conspiracy but by decay. Chance, too, plays a cruel role. Pompeii was preserved only because a volcano buried it in ash. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived only because they were sealed in jars in dry caves. If those events had not occurred, we might know nothing of them. How many civilizations flourished and vanished without such accidents of preservation? How many stories were never written in stone or hidden in caves? We see the survivors, the lucky fragments, and we call them the beginning. But they may only be the remnants of a far older and deeper story. Sometimes records are lost, not by accident, but by human practicality. Stone from old temples is reused to build new ones. Parchment is scraped clean and rewritten when materials are scarce. To those who lived in those times, the past was less valuable than the present. A forgotten inscription was no tragedy. It was simply an opportunity to recycle. Yet for us, centuries later, that decision erases entire histories. We are left with half the story, and the missing half may have been the most important. War compounds this erasure. Armies burn archives, loot libraries, and topple monuments. The destruction is not just collateral. Sometimes it is deliberate. Conquerors destroy the memory of the conquered, erasing their past to secure their own rule. The result is that we inherit a version of history filtered through the lens of victors, while the voices of the vanquished vanish. And once records are gone, they cannot be replaced. Even when records survive, they may not tell the truth. History is often written by the powerful, who decide what is worth remembering and what should be forgotten. In ancient times, kings commissioned chronicles that glorified their reigns while omitting their failures. In more recent centuries, colonial powers rewrote the histories of the people they conquered, replacing local traditions with their own narratives. The result is a record that is not complete, but curated, shaped as much by omission as by preservation. For archaeologists and historians today, this means that even when we read the past, we are not reading the whole story. We are reading a version of it, edited across generations. Digital technology, far from solving this problem, has made it more precarious. We imagine that storing information in the cloud makes it permanent. Yet the cloud is not the sky. It is servers, hard drives, and fragile machines dependent on electricity. Without power, without maintenance, digital archives would decay within decades. File formats become obsolete, hardware becomes unreadable, and data disappears. If a reset occurred today, most of our knowledge would vanish almost instantly. In 1,000 years, archaeologists might find fragments of plastic, corroded circuits, and indecipherable code. Our vast libraries of information would be reduced to silence, no more accessible than an undeciphered script on an ancient tablet. Oral traditions have preserved memory across millennia, but they are not immune to distortion. Stories told around fires are powerful, but with every retelling, details change. Facts become symbols, events become myths, and practical instructions become metaphors. A story about a great flood may begin as a memory of rising seas, but evolve into a tale of divine punishment. A story about a tool may become a legend about a magical weapon. Oral traditions preserve the skeleton of memory, but often strip away its flesh, leaving us with fragments we must interpret without context. Selective preservation adds yet another layer of distortion. Not all records are kept. Some are deliberately destroyed. Dangerous ideas, rivaled religions, or inconvenient truths are erased by rulers who fear them. The result is that even when we find records, they reflect not the whole spectrum of human experience, but only what was permitted to survive. The silence between those records may be louder than the words themselves. The role of luck cannot be overstated. We know of Pompeii not because it was unique, but because it was buried in ash. We know of the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were hidden in caves. How many cities, scrolls, or monuments never had such luck? Their absence shapes our story more than their presence. We tell ourselves that we know history, but we are building castles on sand, filling in vast gaps with speculation. And if resets have happened, those gaps are not just empty. They are the places where entire civilizations once stood. The fragility of records means that what we call history may be only the tiniest sliver of the truth. Civilizations that lasted thousands of years may have vanished without leaving more than a scattering of artifacts. Technologies may have been invented, perfected, and lost long before we thought possible. We see sudden leaps in the record and assume they are miracles of genius, but they may simply be rediscoveries, fragments of knowledge preserved by chance. If history has been reset more than once, then the vanishing of records is not a minor inconvenience. It is the very reason we cannot see the full picture. Every collapse wipes away archives, burns scrolls, and scatters oral traditions. Survivors rebuild with fragments, but within a few generations, the details are gone. What remains is silence, filled with myths that may or may not reflect the truth. And in that silence, entire ages are buried beyond recovery. The vanishing records problem forces us to see history not as a complete story, but as a patchwork of fragments stitched together by chance. We are left with scraps of memory, and from those scraps we build narratives that feel whole. But they are not whole. They are riddled with holes, gaps where entire civilizations could have lived, thrived, and fallen. If resets have happened before, they did not just erase buildings and people. They erased memory itself, leaving us to wonder whether we are standing on the ruins of worlds we will never know. Every so often, amidst the silences of history, we stumble across evidence that feels like a spark from a long-forgotten fire. Discoveries that suggest ancient people may have possessed knowledge or technologies far beyond what we usually grant them. These findings do not sit comfortably in the neat progression of primitive to modern. Instead, they stand like outliers, raising the unsettling possibility that at least some ancient societies were far more advanced than we assume, perhaps inheriting fragments of forgotten knowledge from earlier ages before resets swept most of it away. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the most striking of these anomalies. Pulled from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901, it appeared at first to be nothing more than a corroded lump of bronze. But as researchers examined it, they realized it contained a complex system of gears, dials, and inscriptions. It was, in essence, a mechanical computer capable of predicting eclipses and tracking the positions of the planets with astonishing accuracy. For decades, scholars could scarcely believe it was 2,000 years old. Nothing else like it appears in the historical record until the development of sophisticated clockwork many centuries later. How could such precision exist, vanish, and then reappear? Was the mechanism the product of isolated genius, or was it a fragment of an older tradition of technology, one that survived just long enough to be carried aboard that doomed ship. Stone monuments tell similar stories. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built more than 4,000 years ago, is aligned with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal points of the compass. Its base is level to within fractions of an inch, and its blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, are fitted with astonishing precision. Modern engineers can replicate this feat, but only with advanced tools and machinery. How, then, did ancient builders accomplish it without the technology we believe they possessed? We call it ingenuity. But ingenuity does not explain why such precision appears suddenly, almost fully formed, in the archaeological record. If resets are real, perhaps the knowledge of geometry, measurement, and engineering was not invented entirely anew, but inherited from an earlier, forgotten chapter. In South America, the mystery deepens. At Sacsayhuaman in Peru, enormous stones are cut and fitted together in irregular patterns so exact that the joints have survived centuries of earthquakes. The blocks weigh dozens of tons, yet they are stacked without mortar, their edges so tightly aligned that even a knife cannot slip between them. Moving and shaping such stones with the tools we assign to the Inca seems improbable, and yet the walls stand as proof. Were these feats the result of skills passed down imperfectly? Echoes of techniques known to earlier peoples whose memory was lost in resets? Ancient India offers its own puzzles. Texts written thousands of years ago contain astronomical knowledge so precise that it seems uncanny. Some Vedic texts describe the Earth orbiting the Sun and estimate the length of the solar year with remarkable accuracy. These could be explained by careful observation, but the level of precision raises questions. Were ancient astronomers truly working from scratch, or were they building on fragments of knowledge preserved from an earlier, erased world? The Mahabharata even describes weapons that resemble modern technologies, with vivid depictions of blasts that char the earth and blind warriors with light. Are these merely myths or distorted memories of forgotten tools? Artifacts sometimes push the boundaries even further. The so-called Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, may have functioned as a simple galvanic cell, capable of producing an electric current. If intentional, it suggests knowledge of electricity more than a millennium before it was supposedly discovered. Some scholars dismiss it as coincidence, but the possibility lingers. Even if it was not a battery, the fact that we cannot say with certainty reflects how incomplete our understanding of the past really is. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of andesite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, have been carved with straight edges, right angles, and precise drill holes. The level of craftsmanship is extraordinary, and achieving it with the primitive tools we assign to the builders would have been nearly impossible. Either they possessed skills we underestimate, or they had tools and techniques we no longer understand. If resets have erased entire traditions of technology, Pumapunku may be a surviving fragment, a whisper from an earlier world. Skeptics insist that all these feats can be explained through ingenuity, time, and labor. And perhaps they can. But taken together, they form a pattern. Sudden bursts of precision and knowledge that do not fit smoothly into the timeline, followed by long stretches when those skills vanish. If humanity has been through cycles of rise and collapse, this is exactly what we would expect. Fragments of advanced knowledge surviving for a time, then disappearing, only to be rediscovered later as though for the first time. It is important to remember that advanced knowledge does not always appear as machines or monuments. Sometimes it is intangible: mathematics, navigation, medicine, astronomy. Polynesian navigators, for example, crossed vast stretches of open ocean using only the stars, wave patterns, and bird movements for guidance. These techniques required no machines, only knowledge. And yet they were forgotten in some regions, surviving only in fragments of oral tradition. The skill had to be reconstructed centuries later. If such complex knowledge could vanish in historical times, how many other traditions may have disappeared entirely in the deep past? The unsettling possibility is that what we see as invention may often be reinvention. The Antikythera mechanism may not have been the first of its kind, but the last survivor of an older lineage. The precision of Giza may not have been the start of engineering genius, but a continuation of a knowledge that has since been erased. The astronomical calculations of ancient India may not have been miracles of insight, but memories of a time when the heavens had been mapped long before. If resets have happened, then advanced ancient technologies are not anomalies. They are clues, evidence that humanity has climbed to great heights before, only to fall and forget. Each time, fragments survive: a machine, a monument, a myth. Each time, those fragments inspire future generations to rediscover what was once known. To us, they look like outliers, like miracles. But to the deep past, they may have been ordinary, the everyday tools of worlds now erased. And this realization forces us to reconsider our own place in time. We believe our technologies set us apart, that our machines, networks, and sciences make us immune to the fragility of the past. But perhaps we are not unique. Perhaps we are only the latest iteration of a cycle that has played out many times before. Our skyscrapers and satellites may feel immortal, but so did the pyramids to those who built them. If resets have erased advanced worlds before, they can erase ours too. And thousands of years from now, perhaps some fragment of our own technology will be unearthed, corroded, and mysterious, leaving future archaeologists to wonder how such sophistication could appear and vanish again. One of the strangest patterns in the story of humanity is how often discoveries seem to appear more than once. We are told that invention is a straight path. Someone creates a new tool or idea, and from that point onward, progress moves forward. But the archaeological record does not always agree. Instead, it suggests that many breakthroughs may not have been created only once, but rediscovered again and again, as though humanity were piecing together fragments of knowledge remembered from earlier times. If resets are real, this is exactly what we would expect. Memory shattered, knowledge lost, and then sparks of recognition lighting up across different places and ages. Take writing, for example. Historians point to Mesopotamia as its birthplace, with cuneiform etched into clay tablets around 3200 BCE. But writing also appears in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, and in Mesoamerica, each system distinct, each seemingly emerging independently. How does something so complex appear fully formed in so many places without clear evidence of gradual experimentation? Perhaps these cultures were rediscovering a skill that had existed before, carried in fragments across oral traditions, or encoded in symbols whose true meaning had been forgotten. To us, they look like fresh inventions. To the survivors of resets, they may have been reinventions, echoes of a lost ability. Metallurgy tells a similar story. The smelting of copper, the alloying of bronze, the forging of iron. Each of these requires sophisticated knowledge of ores, heat, and chemistry. And yet these techniques appear in different parts of the world at different times, sometimes separated by thousands of years. Did multiple cultures truly stumble upon such difficult processes independently? Or were they reviving techniques that had been practiced before, then lost in collapse? Imagine a society that knew how to smelt and forge, erased by famine or flood, leaving only myths of magical fire. Generations later, another group experiments with heat and ore, guided perhaps by fragments of those old stories, and rediscovers what was once common knowledge. Agriculture, too, does not fit neatly into the idea of a single origin. We are told it began in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. Yet archaeological evidence shows that domestication of plants and animals also occurred independently in East Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, and in the Pacific. This global pattern may reflect adaptability, but it may also suggest something else. If earlier resets had wiped away knowledge of farming, survivors might have carried fragments of it into different regions, reintroducing the idea in waves rather than inventing it from nothing. What we call the Neolithic Revolution may not have been a single discovery, but a remembering, scattered and imperfect, of practices known in deeper ages. Navigation offers another case. Polynesian voyagers mastered the vast Pacific Ocean, traveling thousands of miles between tiny islands without compasses or maps. They read the stars, the swells of waves, the flight patterns of birds, carrying a body of knowledge that allowed them to chart seas most of the world had never crossed. Yet this knowledge was fragile. In some places it was lost and had to be reconstructed centuries later. Without teachers to pass it on, entire traditions of navigation vanished within a few generations. If such advanced skills can disappear so quickly in recent history, why not in the deeper past? Perhaps long before compasses and sextants, humans possessed equally advanced systems of travel, wiped out in resets, remembered only in fragments that later inspired rediscovery. Even the wheel, one of humanity's most basic inventions, has a curious history. The earliest known wheels appear in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, already fully functional. Yet they do not appear everywhere at once. In some regions, they emerge much later, often in designs already quite advanced. Why would such a simple and useful invention take so long to spread? Perhaps it had existed before, lost during collapses, and returned in places where memory lingered. Each time it reappeared, it did so not as a clumsy prototype, but as a tool already refined, as though it had been remembered rather than newly imagined. Medicine, too, shows signs of this cycle. Ancient texts from India, Egypt, and China describe surgical techniques, herbal treatments, and even dental procedures far more advanced than we would expect for their time. Some of these practices disappeared for centuries, only to be rediscovered later in different cultures. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes into the skull, appears across the globe, in societies separated by oceans. Was this an independent practice, or was it knowledge carried through resets, scattered and imperfect, but resilient enough to survive in fragments? These repeated inventions suggest that knowledge is not as linear as we like to think. It is fragile, easily lost, and just as easily rediscovered under the right conditions. The cycle fits the idea of resets perfectly. Each collapse erases most of what was known. Survivors carry fragments forward, stories of magical fire, symbols whose meanings have faded, memories of tools they can no longer make. Generations later, those fragments inspire rediscovery. The wheel returns, writing blooms, metallurgy is reborn. To archaeologists, it looks like invention. In truth, it may be reinvention, humanity climbing the same stairs again after being cast down. Even myths may serve as carriers of memory. A legend about a skyboat could inspire experiments in navigation. A story about a healing stone could lead to the rediscovery of a medicinal plant. A tale of a weapon wielded by gods might preserve a distorted memory of advanced technology, inspiring later attempts to replicate it. Survivors of resets may not have understood the knowledge they inherited, but they passed it on in stories, and those stories later seeded new discoveries. The pattern of repeated inventions also explains why progress sometimes feels uneven. We see sudden leaps, writing appearing fully formed, metallurgy emerging in multiple places, agriculture blossoming across continents, without the long, gradual buildup we expect. These leaps may not be leaps at all, but echoes of earlier heights. Each reset scatters the pieces of the puzzle, and each new age picks them up in different ways, reconstructing fragments of what once was. If this is true, then we must rethink how we view our own achievements. We believe ourselves to be at the cutting edge, inventing technologies never seen before. But perhaps we are not always inventors. Perhaps we are rediscoverers, guided by fragments of memory we do not even realize we carry. The things we marvel at as breakthroughs may be the faint echoes of older knowledge, resurfacing after being buried in silence. The unsettling part is what this suggests about our future. If resets have happened before, then our own inventions may not be permanent either. The wheel, writing, metallurgy, navigation, medicine, all have been lost and rediscovered. What if electricity, digital technology, or flight were lost in a future collapse? Survivors might preserve fragments in myth, stories of glowing boxes that spoke, of metal birds that flew, of towers that touched the sky. Generations later, people might rediscover these wonders, believing them new. In truth, they would only be retracing the paths of ancestors, repeating the cycle once again. The puzzle of repeated inventions is not just a curiosity, it is a clue. It tells us that history may not be a single climb, but a spiral, winding upward and downward, inventions appearing, vanishing, and reappearing. We live in one of those peaks now, believing ourselves unique. But if resets are real, then our place in the cycle is temporary. And one day, far into the future, our descendants may look at our fragments and wonder how such knowledge appeared, vanished, and returned once more. If fragments of technology survive resets in the form of artifacts, then myths serve as the other great vessel of memory. They are not written in stone or inscribed on clay, but carried in the minds and voices of generations. Myths are often dismissed as fantasy, the imaginative storytelling of pre-literate people, but closer inspection reveals that many of them may encode memories of real events. They are not literal histories, but they may be distorted echoes of catastrophes, encounters, or achievements long forgotten. If resets are real, then myths are the oldest survivors, fragile yet resilient, whispering truths disguised as legends. Flood stories are among the most universal of these myths. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim building a great boat to survive a deluge sent by the gods. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah builds an ark to save his family and the animals of the earth. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a giant fish of an impending flood and builds a vessel to survive. Indigenous peoples from the Americas to Polynesia tell stories of waters rising and swallowing the land. The details differ, but the motif is the same. The world drowned, survivors rebuilt. Such consistency across cultures separated by oceans is difficult to explain as coincidence. It makes far more sense if these are memories, passed down from survivors of rising seas at the end of the last ice age, when coastlines vanished beneath 400 feet of water. Other myths recall fire from the sky. The Greeks told of Phaethon, who lost control of the sun's chariot, setting the earth ablaze until Zeus struck him down. The Hopi of North America speak of worlds destroyed by fire. Hindu texts describe weapons of such brilliance that they burned the earth and blinded those who saw them. These tales may be symbolic, but they may also be echoes of real cosmic events. Meteors streaking through the atmosphere, impacts that caused firestorms, volcanic eruptions that filled skies with ash. To those who lived through such events, it would have seemed like divine fire, and their descendants would remember it as myth long after the details were lost. Legends of lost golden ages appeared just as consistently. The Greeks believed in successive ages of humanity: gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each one worse than the last. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles in which virtue declines until the world collapses and begins anew. Mesoamerican myths describe successive suns, each representing a destroyed world replaced by another. These are not random inventions. They are descriptions of cycles, of resets, remembered in symbolic language. The message is always the same. The world has ended before, and it will end again. Even the myths of gods themselves may encode memories of earlier worlds. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki were deities who taught humans writing, agriculture, and law. In Egypt, Thoth was credited with giving humanity knowledge of writing and mathematics. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent who brought wisdom, maize, and learning. These gods may not have been literal deities, but cultural memories of figures who carried fragments of knowledge across resets, survivors of earlier collapses sharing what they could. Over time, their human nature was forgotten, and they became gods in legend, their teachings remembered as divine gifts rather than salvaged knowledge. Astronomical myths add another layer of mystery. The alignment of monuments like Stonehenge, Chichen Itza, and the Great Pyramids with solstices, equinoxes, or star systems suggests a deep and ancient interest in the heavens. Myths often reflect this. The Dogon people of Mali tell stories of Sirius, including details about its companion star invisible to the naked eye, details confirmed by modern astronomy only recently. Did they preserve fragments of astronomical knowledge inherited from earlier ages? Or did chance and observation explain it? Skeptics lean toward coincidence. But in the context of resets, myths of the stars may be the last traces of ancient sky watchers whose precision rivaled our own. Myths of giants and titans also resonate with this idea. From the Greek Titans to the biblical Nephilim, from Norse Jotnar to Native American stories of enormous beings, cultures worldwide tell of giant ancestors or adversaries. Perhaps these are distorted memories of encountering the ruins of earlier civilizations. Walls so massive, stones so large, that they seemed the work of giants. Without context, people explained what they saw in the only way they could, by imagining beings larger than themselves. The ruins of Baalbek or Sacsayhuaman could easily inspire such myths if their true builders had already been forgotten. The persistence of these motifs across the globe suggests they are not random. They are cultural fossils, memories of resets encoded in story form. Unlike stone, myths can move, carried by migrating peoples, reshaped by each new teller, but preserving the core of the memory. When a flood myth appears in Mesopotamia and Polynesia alike, it suggests that the story is older than either culture, passed down from ancestors who experienced rising seas together. When myths of fire from the sky appear in Greece, India, and the Americas, it suggests a memory of real events so powerful that they imprinted themselves across continents. Skeptics argue that these motifs are universal because they reflect universal fears: flood, fire, famine, and loss. And perhaps that is part of it. But the specificity of some myths suggests more. Aboriginal stories in Australia describe coastlines as they were 12,000 years ago, before sea levels rose. Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest preserve oral traditions of earthquakes and tsunamis that match geological events known to have occurred in the year 1700. These are not vague allegories. They are accurate memories preserved for centuries or even millennia. If such precision can survive that long, why not longer? Why not across resets? The power of myth lies not in its literal truth, but in its endurance. Myths outlive libraries, cities, even languages. They can survive resets because they are carried not in fragile materials, but in the human mind. They adapt to new circumstances, reshaping themselves to remain relevant. But in doing so, they preserve kernels of the past. A flood becomes a story of divine punishment, but at its core it remembers rising waters. A tale of gods bringing knowledge may disguise the memory of survivors sharing skills. A legend of giants may record the awe of encountering megalithic ruins. If resets have happened, then myths are the closest thing we have to a continuous record. They are not precise, but they are resilient. They remember in ways that stone and parchment cannot. And when we listen to them with fresh ears, setting aside the assumption that they are mere fantasy, we hear something deeper. A chorus of voices across time, warning us that we are not the first, that worlds have ended before, and that our own world, too, stands on fragile ground. If myths preserve the emotional memory of resets, then cycles preserve the structural memory. Across cultures, we find not just stories of individual catastrophes, but systems of thought that see time itself as repeating. History not as a straight line, but as an endless wheel. To modern eyes, these ideas may look like poetry, but they may also be the wisdom of survivors. People who lived through collapses and recognized the rhythm of rise and fall, remembering not only their own suffering, but the suffering of ages before them. These cycles are not merely metaphors. They are frameworks that insist resets are not exceptions, but inevitabilities. In ancient India, Hindu cosmology describes vast ages called yugas. The Satya Yuga is the golden age, when truth and virtue flourish. Each successive age declines in righteousness until the Kali Yuga, an age of darkness, corruption, and collapse. At the end, the cycle begins anew, and humanity climbs again. To modern readers, these ages may seem like myth. But what if they are the encoded memories of resets, golden ages remembered as past peaks of civilization, dark ages remembered as aftermaths of collapse, each cycle repeating over spans too long for written history to hold? Survivors would not think of time as progress, but as return, as endless spirals of creation and destruction. The Maya held a similar vision. Their calendar, often sensationalized, was not a prediction of a single apocalypse, but a record of successive worlds. Each sun, as they called it, represented an age of humanity, ended by catastrophe, flood, fire, wind, or earthquake. We live, they believed, in the fifth sun, with 4 worlds destroyed before us. Skeptics interpret these as myths born of imagination, but perhaps they are fragments of memory, the echoes of cycles preserved in ritual and stone. If resets occurred, then the Maya were not predicting the end. They were remembering that it had already happened, again and again. The Greeks spoke of the ages of man: golden, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Each successive age declined in virtue and strength, each marked by suffering greater than the last. The Golden Age was a time of abundance and harmony, when people lived close to the gods. The Iron Age, in which Hesiod claimed to live, was one of toil, violence, and misery. These ages are often read as allegory, but they also mirror the cycles described in other parts of the world. Golden ages collapse into dark ages, civilizations rise and fall, resets erase memory, and begin anew. The Greeks, too, may have inherited the sense that time is not progress, but repetition. Even in Norse mythology, we find echoes of cycles. Ragnarok is the great destruction. When gods and giants destroy one another, the world burns and floods. And yet from the ashes a new world emerges. This is not an ending, but a reset, a renewal, the beginning of another cycle. Across the globe, cultures with no contact described time in similar ways, not as a ladder, but as a wheel, not as progress, but as recurrence. Such agreement suggests not coincidence, but experience, shared memories of collapse encoded into the deepest layers of culture. Why would so many societies embrace cyclical time? Perhaps because they had lived through resets themselves. Survivors of catastrophe would see clearly that civilizations are fragile. They would see that knowledge can vanish, that abundance can turn to famine, that peace can collapse into chaos. To them, the idea that time moves forward endlessly would seem naive. Instead, they would recognize the rhythm of rise and fall. They would teach their children not to expect permanence, but to expect return. What we see as mythology may be the world view of survivors who understood resets better than we do. The idea of cycles also appears in philosophy. The Stoics of ancient Greece believed in ekpyrosis, the periodic destruction of the world by fire, followed by renewal. Plato spoke of great floods and destructions that erased memory, leaving only a few survivors to rebuild. In his dialogues, he suggested that human history is much older than commonly believed, with resets erasing the record again and again. Even in China, dynastic cycles describe the rise of rulers blessed by the mandate of heaven, followed by decline, corruption, collapse, and renewal. Though less cosmic, these cycles reflect the same truth. Nothing lasts forever, and what falls will one day rise again. Science, too, offers its own cycles, though often without recognizing the resonance. Ice ages advance and retreat in rhythm. Species evolve and vanish in waves. Geological layers reveal patterns of extinction and renewal. Even stars are born, burn, and die, scattering the elements that seed new suns. The cosmos itself is cyclical, creation and destruction woven into its fabric. Human civilizations, fragile as they are, cannot escape this rhythm. If resets have happened before, then they are not accidents but expressions of the deeper cycles that govern all things. The humbling lesson of cycles is that permanence is an illusion. We imagine ourselves to be the pinnacle, the end of the climb, but every culture before us thought the same. The Sumerians believed their kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, eternal in their memory. The Egyptians built monuments to last forever. The Romans called their empire eternal. Yet all of them fell, and their permanence proved fragile. We are no different. We may call our age modern, advanced, global, but in the face of cycles, we are simply the latest chapter. Our own cycles may already be turning. Climate shifts, resource pressures, wars, and pandemics all echo the patterns of collapse that ended earlier ages. If the past is a guide, then our golden age of technology may one day give way to darkness, our records erased, our cities buried, our memory reduced to myth. Future generations may see us not as unique, but as one more sun, one more age, one more turn of the wheel. To them, we will be the ancestors of legend, remembered in fragments, our achievements exaggerated into miracles, our failures forgotten. The cycles of myth remind us that resets are not rare. They are woven into the rhythm of existence. To deny them is to ignore the chorus of voices across cultures and centuries, all telling us the same thing. The world has ended before, and it will end again. What we call history is only one arc of the wheel, one rise among many. Beneath our feet lie the ruins of others, and above us loom the shadows of futures yet to come. The cycle turns, and we turn with it, fragile passengers on a wheel that never stops. If cycles and myths whisper of forgotten resets, archaeology gives us the most tangible evidence, ruins and artifacts that defy easy explanation. They rise from jungles, deserts, and mountains like questions carved into stone, daring us to explain how and why they were made. Some fit neatly into our story of progress. Others do not. They are the stubborn anomalies, the puzzles that suggest we may not know the full truth of the past. And if resets are real, these sites may be the scattered fingerprints of worlds erased, fragments of civilizations that reached heights before tumbling into silence. Göbekli Tepe is perhaps the most haunting of these sites. Built over 11,000 years ago, it predates agriculture, villages, and writing. Yet it is monumental. Massive pillars weighing up to 20 tons are arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with intricate carvings of animals. According to the standard narrative, hunter-gatherers at that time should have been incapable of organizing such a project. They should have lacked the tools, the surplus food, the complex social structures needed for architecture on this scale. And yet the stones stand, whispering that someone had the knowledge to design and build them. Mainstream archaeology struggles to explain this anomaly, But in the context of resets, Göbekli Tepe becomes something else, a remnant of an older memory, a survivor of knowledge that was not supposed to exist. Travel to the Andes, and the questions multiply. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of andesite, harder than steel, have been cut with precision edges, drill holes, and right angles so exact they resemble machine work. Some blocks weigh over 100 tons. Moving and shaping them with the tools we assign to the builders seems almost impossible. Yet there they lie, scattered as though by some catastrophe, their purpose forgotten. Was Pumapunku the work of ingenious stonemasons alone, or was it the last echo of a forgotten age, built with knowledge carried through a reset and then lost again? In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza stands as another anomaly. Aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal points, its base is level within fractions of an inch, and its internal chambers reflect mathematical relationships so precise they rival modern engineering. We are told that copper tools and human labor built it, but the leap in scale and precision compared to earlier monuments is staggering. If resets occurred, the pyramid may represent not a beginning, but a continuation. Knowledge inherited imperfectly from an earlier age and crystallized in stone before being forgotten again. Other sites deepen the mystery. The megaliths of Baalbek in Lebanon include stones weighing more than 1,000 tons, far beyond the lifting capacity of ancient technology as we understand it. In Micronesia, the city of Nan Madol sits on artificial islets built from massive basalt logs, arranged with geometric precision across a lagoon. On Easter Island, Moai statues loom, their purpose debated, their origins uncertain. These sites do not tell us what was lost, but they suggest that what survived is only a fraction of what once existed. Even maps raise questions. The Piri race map, drawn in the 16th century, appears to show parts of South America with striking accuracy, long before explorers had charted them fully. Some argue it even depicts Antarctica free of ice, which, if true, would suggest knowledge from a time before the continent froze over. Scholars explain this as the product of copying from older, now lost maps. But if those sources existed, who made them? If resets are real, perhaps the mapmakers of Piri Reis were drawing on charts inherited from forgotten worlds, fragments that survived collapse only to resurface centuries later. Artifacts, too, offer whispers of forgotten sophistication. The Baghdad battery may or may not have generated electricity, but its possibility forces us to question our assumptions. Ancient surgical tools found in Greece and India show designs far more advanced than we expect. Glass lenses discovered in Assyrian ruins hint at optical knowledge thousands of years earlier than believed. Each artifact, taken alone, can be explained away. But taken together, they paint a picture of ancient people with skills and technologies that do not fit neatly into the linear story of invention. Even myths align with these anomalies. Cultures across the world speak of giants who built walls, gods who brought knowledge, golden ages that ended in catastrophe. When we stand before the precision of Sacsayhuaman or the enormity of Baalbek, it is easy to see why. To those who came after with simpler tools, the ruins must have seemed impossible, the work of beings larger or wiser than themselves. Myths filled the gaps where memory had failed, transforming forgotten engineers into gods and forgotten builders into giants. What is striking is how quickly knowledge can vanish. After the fall of Rome, the The formula for concrete was lost for more than 1,000 years. After the Spanish burned Mayan codices, centuries of astronomy and ritual disappeared in a single night. After the Mongols destroyed Baghdad's House of Wisdom, science in the region suffered a setback from which it never fully recovered. If such losses can happen within the span of recorded history, how much more must have been lost in deeper time, when resets erased not just records, but entire worlds. The ruins we see today may be only the tip of the iceberg. Most of the Earth has not been excavated. Vast areas of forest, desert, and seabed may conceal structures and artifacts beyond our imagination. The oceans in particular hide enormous secrets. At the end of the last ice age, rising seas drowned thousands of miles of coastline where humans had lived for millennia. If civilizations had thrived there, their ruins are now buried under hundreds of feet of water, beyond the reach of casual discovery. One day, with better technology, we may find them. Until then, the silence of the ocean is itself a clue, an archive of memory drowned by time. In the context of resets, archaeology takes on a new meaning. It is not merely the study of the past, but the excavation of forgotten worlds. Each stone circle, each submerged ruin, each anomalous artifact is a fragment of a story much older than we admit. They suggest that our timeline is not smooth but jagged, broken by resets, with civilizations rising and falling, their memory erased, their fragments scattered. We stand among their ruins, not understanding that they may once have stood where we stand now. The lesson is humbling. The ruins remind us that permanence is an illusion, that even the greatest works of stone can be toppled or forgotten. If resets have happened, then our own cities may one day be ruins too, their purpose debated, their builders mythologized. Future archaeologists may marvel at skyscraper foundations, at corroded satellites, at fragments of machines they cannot explain. And they may wonder, as we do now, whether they are the first to walk this path, or simply the latest in a long line of civilizations erased by time. To imagine resets is to imagine not only the silence of the past, but also the vulnerability of our present. For all our machines, our satellites, our glowing towers of glass and steel, we are no less fragile than those who came before. In fact, in some ways, we may be more fragile. Ancient civilizations were regional, scattered, self-contained. If one fell, others endured. Our world, by contrast, is global, interconnected, and dependent on fragile networks that can collapse like a house of cards. If resets have happened before, we are perched at the edge of another, and it may not take a super volcano or an asteroid to bring it about. It may take only ourselves. Consider how utterly dependent we are on electricity. Nearly every aspect of modern life, food, water, medicine, communication, transportation, relies on a continuous flow of power. Without it, our world stalls. A massive solar storm, like the Carrington event of 1859, could disable satellites, fry transformers, and plunge cities into darkness. In the 19th century, telegraph wires sparked and burned, but life went on. In the 21st, such a storm would collapse the very systems that hold civilization together. Within days, communication would fail. Within weeks, food and medicine would run out. Within months, chaos would spread. Survivors would not be telling stories of electrons and magnetic storms. They would speak of a time when the sky sent fire and the world went dark. The digital revolution, which we treat as the pinnacle of progress, is also our greatest vulnerability. We have placed our memory into servers, hard drives, and clouds that exist only so long as electricity flows. Ancient scrolls might survive in caves for millennia. Digital files vanish in decades if not constantly maintained. Imagine a collapse of global infrastructure, servers offline, power grids shattered. What would survive of our knowledge? Some books, perhaps, some inscriptions, but the vast archive of humanity, billions of documents, videos, scientific data, would vanish into silence. To future generations, our world might appear suddenly in the archaeological record, with little explanation of how we lived or what we achieved. Our internet would become a forgotten age, spoken of as myth. Interconnection, our greatest strength, is also our greatest weakness. In ancient times, a city might fall without toppling an empire. Today, a failure in one part of the network ripples instantly across the globe. A financial crash in one country sends shockwaves through all others. A virus that emerges in one city spreads in weeks to every continent. A cyber attack on power grids or satellites could paralyze entire nations. We imagine ourselves resilient, but our complexity makes us fragile. When one thread of the web breaks, the whole net begins to unravel. This is how resets may begin, not with a single catastrophic blow, but with cascading failures that spiral out of control. Even our abundance may betray us. The supply chains that feed billions are finely tuned, operating on speed and efficiency, not resilience. Supermarkets hold only days of food. Cities depend on trucks, ships, and planes that must move constantly. Interrupt the flow, and shelves empty within a week. In the event of collapse, survivors would scatter from cities into the countryside, searching for food and safety. Skills of farming, hunting, and foraging, once common, are now rare. Without them, many would perish. Those who survived would not remember the details of the collapse, only the hunger, the fear, the silence when the lights went out. Their descendants would inherit not libraries, but stories. And stories, as always, would become myths. War adds another layer of danger. For the first time in history, we possess weapons capable of destroying not only armies, but the entire infrastructure of civilization. Nuclear war would not simply kill millions, it would shatter systems, darken skies with ash, collapse agriculture, and erase the fragile memory of our age. Survivors would not rebuild skyscrapers or satellites. They would gather around fires, telling tales of a world that once glowed with lights brighter than stars, of flying machines and voices that traveled through the air. To them, these would be miracles. To their descendants, they would be myths of gods. Pandemics, too, remain an ever-present threat. The Black Death reshaped Europe in the 14th century, and recent history has shown how quickly disease can spread across a globalized world. A truly devastating pandemic could collapse health systems, strain economies, and destabilize nations. Survivors would carry the memory of sickness, of fear, of collapse, and those memories would shape the myths of future generations. A story of a plague that consumed the world might sound like allegory, but it could be the only surviving trace of a reset. Climate change is slower, but no less powerful. Rising seas, shifting weather, collapsing ecosystems all threaten the stability of global civilization. Ancient cultures remembered climate shifts as floods, droughts, or famines. We, too, may one day see our age reduced to such terms. Cities drowned, deserts spreading, fields barren. These may be the memories our descendants carry, stripped of scientific explanation, transformed into stories of divine punishment or cosmic cycles. If resets have happened before, climate has likely been one of their great engines, slowly but relentlessly erasing what once was. The sobering truth is that our modern world is not immune to the forces that erased the past. In some ways, we are more exposed. We depend on fragile systems, centralized networks, and knowledge stored in forms that cannot survive collapse. We are confident in our progress, but confidence is the illusion that has preceded every fall. The Sumerians believed their cities eternal. The Egyptians built for eternity. The Romans called their empire without end. Each believed permanence was theirs. Each was wrong. If a reset comes in our time, the survivors will carry fragments, just as survivors always have. They will tell stories of towers that touched the sky, of invisible webs that connected the world, of glowing boxes that spoke with human voices. They will remember aircraft as great birds of metal, satellites as stars that fell from the heavens, machines as servants of fire. Over generations, these memories will blur. Myth will take the place of memory. And thousands of years from now, archaeologists may stand among the ruins of our cities, asking the same questions we ask of Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, or Baalbek. Who built this? How? Why? And where did they go? The haunting possibility is that this cycle has played out many times. Civilizations rise, build, and fall. Survivors scatter, myths endure, and fragments remain. Each time, humanity believes it is the first. Each time, it believes it is the last. But the earth is patient, and time is long. Resets may be the rule, not the exception. And if that is true, then our age is not the pinnacle of history, but simply another layer in the spiral, destined like the others to vanish into silence and myth. To stand in the present and imagine resets is to feel a strange double vision. On one side, we see ourselves as the culmination of all that has come before. Masters of technology, explorers of space, architects of a global civilization. On the other, we see the fragility of it all, the way memory can vanish, the way time can grind everything into silence. What bridges these two visions is the humbling recognition that we may not be unique. We may not be the first to stand at such a peak. And if that is true, then the ruins and myths we study are not mysteries from another species, but echoes of ourselves, repeating the same story across the deep currents of time. Imagine the survivors of a reset in some forgotten age. They wander among the ruins of their fallen world, unable to explain the machines or monuments around them. To their children, they tell stories. The machines become gods. The monuments become the homes of giants. Knowledge is preserved not in equations or texts, but in symbols, rituals, and myths. Over generations, the context fades, and the stories stand alone. By the time archaeologists of a later age uncover the ruins, the only explanations are legends of divine power or supernatural beings. We see this pattern in our own past, when medieval Europeans looked at Roman aqueducts and believed they were built by giants. We should not assume our age would be remembered any differently if it, too, were erased. The persistence of myths across cultures suggests that resets leave a deep imprint on human imagination. Flood myths, fire myths, myths of golden ages and cycles, they are not random. They are collective memories refracted through time. Survivors of catastrophe cling to stories as lifelines, carrying them across generations, reshaping them into allegory, but preserving their core. A people who lived through rising seas would not preserve records of climate models, but they would tell stories of a world drowned. A people who saw meteors streak across the sky would not write about impact craters, but they would tell stories of fire from the heavens. These stories endure because they carry truth, not literal truth, but truth of experience. Archaeology, too, reminds us that fragments of earlier worlds linger beneath our feet. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Pumapunku, Nan Madol, and the Great Pyramid are not just anomalies. They are messages, even if we cannot read them. They tell us that people long ago knew things we do not understand, organized in ways we cannot reconstruct, built in ways we struggle to replicate. Skeptics explain them away as isolated ingenuity, but resets provide another explanation. That these are survivors of older ages, fragments of knowledge carried forward imperfectly, crystallized in stone, and then abandoned when the rest of the tradition was lost. The ocean hides even more. At the end of the last ice age, seas rose hundreds of feet, drowning entire landscapes where people had lived for millennia. Doggerland in Europe, Sundaland in Southeast Asia, Beringia in the Pacific, all were fertile plains now buried underwater. If civilizations had thrived there, their ruins lie in darkness. Occasionally, divers or sonar reveal hints of submerged structures, but most remain hidden. The greatest archives of forgotten worlds may lie not in deserts or jungles, but beneath the sea, waiting for tools we do not yet have. Until then, the silence of the ocean reminds us how much is missing. And then there is the problem of memory itself. Even when knowledge survives a reset, it does not always survive intact. Fragments remain. Symbols, rituals, myths, artifacts, but the context is gone. Future generations interpret them through their own lenses, often distorting the meaning. A mathematical principle becomes a mystical diagram. A technological tool becomes a religious relic. A survival practice becomes a sacred ritual. By the time archaeologists uncover these fragments thousands of years later, they are surrounded by layers of misinterpretation. We are left not with the knowledge itself, but with echoes, distorted and refracted, like voices heard through a cave. This raises a sobering thought. If resets have happened before, perhaps we have been here many times. Perhaps humans have reached heights of knowledge again and again, only to fall, only to scatter, only to rebuild. Each time, fragments survive, myths endure, ruins remain. Each time, future generations mistake the fragments for beginnings rather than survivals. Each time, history is rewritten as a straight line rather than a spiral. The cycle continues, and each age believes itself unique. The implications for our present are enormous. If resets have happened, then our place in history is not secure. Our skyscrapers, satellites, and networks may one day be ruins, artifacts, and myths. Future generations may look back at us and see not the pinnacle of progress, but another forgotten age, another lost chapter in the spiral of time. They may wonder how we lived, how we built, why we fell. They may create myths of towers that touched the sky, of glowing webs that connected the world, of stars that carried human voices. To them, our technologies may seem miraculous, our world incomprehensible. And they will be right, for without context, fragments are always mysteries. This perspective is both unsettling and liberating. It strips away the illusion of permanence, reminding us that all civilizations are temporary. But it also connects us to a deeper continuity. If resets have happened before, then we are part of a much larger story, one that stretches far beyond the narrow window of written history. We are not alone in our rise and fragility. We are companions to countless forgotten worlds, all of us caught in the same cycle of creation and collapse. Perhaps this is the real legacy of resets: humility. To know that others have walked this path before us, to know that their ruins lie beneath our feet, to know that their myths whisper through our stories. This is to recognize that we are not eternal. Our memory is fragile. Our permanence is an illusion. We are not the first, and we will not be the last. And yet, there is also wonder in this idea. If resets have happened, then we are part of a rhythm as old as humanity itself. Our rise and fall is not meaningless, but part of a grand spiral, a story written and erased, again and again. To glimpse that spiral is to feel both small and immense. Small because we are temporary. Immense because we are part of something vast, something far older and larger than we can imagine. The ruins, the myths, the anomalies, they are not just puzzles. They are invitations, urging us to see ourselves not as the end of history, but as its latest beginning. To grasp the idea of resets is to step back and see civilization not as a permanent structure, but as a fragile flame, passed from hand to hand through the winds of time. Sometimes the flame grows into a roaring fire, illuminating cities and empires. Other times it flickers, dims, and nearly dies, leaving only embers for the next generation to kindle anew. If history is a spiral of rise and fall, then each reset is the moment when the flame nearly goes out. What matters most in those moments are the fragments, what survives, what is carried forward, and how it is remembered. Fragments can take many forms. They can be ruins of stone, so enduring that even earthquakes and floods cannot erase them. They can be myths and legends, distorted but persistent, whispered across centuries until their original meaning is unrecognizable, but their core remains. They can be skills and practices, half-remembered, like the Polynesian art of navigating by stars and waves, or the herbal remedies that survive in folk medicine long after their origins are forgotten. In every case, fragments serve as seeds, carried through the collapse, waiting for the chance to grow again when conditions allow. We often marvel at how suddenly progress seems to appear in the archaeological record. Writing blooming fully formed, metallurgy spreading rapidly, agriculture emerging in multiple regions. But perhaps we should not marvel at their suddenness. Perhaps these are simply the moments when fragments survived resets and were rekindled. Survivors remembered symbols, stories, or techniques, incomplete but potent enough to inspire rediscovery. Knowledge does not always have to be passed whole. Even fragments can carry the spark. The problem is that fragments can mislead as easily as they can inspire. A myth of fire from the sky may preserve the memory of a meteor, but it may also become a tale of angry gods hurling weapons. A symbol once used for measurement may turn into a mystical icon, its practical purpose lost. A fragment of a machine may be mistaken for a religious relic. Over time, meaning shifts, and what was once knowledge becomes mystery. When archaeologists uncover these fragments thousands of years later, they see only puzzles. Without context, they cannot tell whether the fragments point to genius or accident, invention or reinvention. This distortion explains why the past often looks both advanced and primitive at the same time. We see precision in stonework, but simplicity in tools. We see astronomical alignments in monuments, but no written records to explain them. We see myths of cycles and floods, but no histories to confirm them. What we are looking at may be fragments of lost worlds, preserved imperfectly, stripped of their context by resets. We are reading torn pages of a book, trying to reconstruct the story from what little remains. Our own world will leave fragments too. If a reset occurred tomorrow, what would survive? Stone structures would endure longest, bridges, monuments, foundations of skyscrapers. Metal would corrode, glass would shatter, and concrete would crumble. But stone would remain. 1,000 years from now, archaeologists might uncover the base of the Eiffel Tower or the ruins of Manhattan, puzzling over their purpose. Digital memory would vanish quickly, leaving almost nothing. Perhaps a few hardened drives or plastic artifacts would survive, their meaning opaque. Survivors would preserve memory and stories, not servers. They would speak of glowing screens, of voices carried through the air, of towers that reached the clouds. To their descendants, these would be myths, exaggerated and symbolic. Thousands of years later, fragments of our world would inspire awe and confusion, just as ancient ruins do for us. This perspective is not meant to diminish our achievements, but to place them in context. If resets have happened before, then we are not alone in our fragility. Other civilizations may have risen to great heights, built wonders, mapped the heavens, and then fallen into silence. Their fragments became our mysteries. Our fragments may one day become mysteries for those who follow. The spiral continues, and each turn erases much but preserves a little, enough to inspire the next climb. The real question is not whether fragments survive, but which fragments survive. The survivors do not always choose what to carry forward. Sometimes chance decides. A library burns, but a single scroll hidden in a cave endures. A city is buried in ash, preserving its streets for millennia, while others vanish without a trace. A myth is told and retold until its origins are lost, but its story persists. In this way, history is curated not by intention, but by accident, shaped by luck, disaster, and the whims of survival. This makes our understanding of the past inherently incomplete. We cannot see the whole, only the fragments that chance has preserved. We build our stories around those fragments, but the gaps are vast. If resets have happened before, then most of what once existed has been erased, leaving us to reconstruct civilizations from scattered ruins and distorted myths. Our certainty about the past is an illusion, built on a foundation of missing pages. Yet there is beauty in this fragility. To see history as a spiral of resets is to recognize that humanity is resilient. We fall, but we rise again. We forget, but we remember enough to rebuild. Each reset is not an ending but a new beginning, a chance to kindle the flame once more. The fragments we carry forward, whether ruins, myths, or practices, are the seeds of renewal. They remind us that even in collapse, not everything is lost. Something always survives. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of resets. They show us that permanence is impossible, but continuity is not. Civilizations will fall, memories will fade, but fragments endure, carried across the gulf of silence, waiting to be remembered. Our world, too, will leave fragments. Our descendants may not understand them, but they will be enough to spark curiosity, to inspire stories, to ignite new discoveries. The spiral will turn again, and humanity, in whatever form, will climb once more. Resets are not just about loss. They are about survival. They are about the persistence of fragments through fire, flood, famine, and forgetting. And they are about the wonder that even in the face of silence, humanity always finds a way to remember, to rebuild, and to begin again. At the edge of this long journey, we return to the central question. What if Earth has been reset thousands of times? The evidence is not laid out in perfect clarity. It comes as fragments, ruins half buried in the earth, myths whispered across oceans, anomalies in maps and artifacts, silences in the record. To skeptics, these are curiosities, coincidences, mistakes. To those willing to look deeper, they form a pattern, a rhythm that suggests history is not a single line, but a spiral, rising and collapsing, erasing and renewing. The truth may be that we are not the first, not the only, and not the last to walk this path. To imagine this is to feel both small and immense. Small, because it strips away the illusion of permanence. We are not the pinnacle of history, only a chapter in a story much older than we can grasp. Our cities, our machines, our digital worlds, all are fragile. They can vanish as quickly as Atlantis, as silently as the Indus, as mysteriously as the Maya. In deep time, permanence does not exist. The earth is a restless canvas, and what we paint upon it is temporary. And yet we are also immense. For if others have walked this path before, we are their inheritors. We carry their fragments, their myths, their ruins. Our own achievements are built not just on the past 5,000 years of written history, but perhaps on countless forgotten ages whose memory survived only as whispers. Every tool, every discovery, every story may carry the ghost of a world erased. We are not alone on this climb. We are joined by the echoes of civilizations that came before, their voices faint but present, urging us onward. The question then becomes not whether resets have happened, but what we will do knowing they may happen again. Do we treat our world as invincible, continuing as though nothing can touch us? Or do we recognize our fragility and act with humility, preparing to preserve what we can? For the first time in history, perhaps, we have the means to resist total erasure. We can store knowledge across multiple mediums, scatter it across the globe, even launch it into space. We can recognize that memory must be protected not just for today, but for tomorrow, for ages yet unborn. But even with this awareness, the forces of nature remain. The earth will quake, the seas will rise, the skies will burn. Cosmic impacts, volcanic winters, pandemics, wars, all remain possible. No amount of preparation can guarantee survival forever. What we can do is ensure that if a reset comes, the flame does not go out completely, that fragments endure, that myths continue to carry kernels of truth, that ruins remain as beacons for future eyes to wonder at. Perhaps this is why we are drawn so powerfully to ancient mysteries. Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Stonehenge, the pyramids, they call to us not because they are puzzles alone, but because they are mirrors. They show us our future as much as our past. They remind us that what is built can be forgotten, that what is known can be lost. They stand as warnings, but also as promises, that even in silence, something survives. That memory, however fragile, can cross the gulf of resets. When we look at myths of floods, of fire from the sky, of golden ages ending in ruin, we should not dismiss them as mere imagination. We should see them as voices, faint but enduring, reaching across time to tell us, we were here, we lived, we fell, but you can rise again. When we see anomalies in stonework, in maps, in artifacts, we should not dismiss them as errors, but recognize them as possible fragments of forgotten chapters. And when we consider our own age, we should not see it as eternal, but as fragile, temporary, part of a cycle larger than we can grasp. This recognition does not diminish us, it ennobles us. To know that we may not be the first is to see ourselves as part of a much greater story. To know that we may not be the last is to see our responsibility. We can choose to be arrogant, to believe we are untouchable. Or we can choose to be humble, to preserve, to prepare, to ensure that if a reset comes, we leave behind not silence, but seeds for those who follow. The spiral of history may turn again. Our skyscrapers may crumble, our satellites may fall, our servers may darken, but fragments will endure. Myths will be told, ruins will whisper, and someday, perhaps thousands of years from now, another age will rise, look back at us, and wonder who we were. To them, we may be gods, giants, or myths. To us, we are only ourselves, fragile and temporary, yet part of something vast. So we return to the flame, fragile, flickering, but persistent, passed from one age to another, from one reset to the next. It is not eternal, but it endures. It is memory. It is humanity. And as long as it is carried, the story does not end. It only begins again.